Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I still feel shaken when I think about it, and it's been weeks since it happened. I ordered a new washing machine after my old one broke down. It wasn't the most exciting purchase, but I was looking forward to getting it set up and not having to drag my laundry to the laundromat anymore. I called the company, scheduled a delivery, and everything seemed normal. It was supposed to be a simple transaction, just get the machine, set it up, and move on. The delivery was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon, and I was working from home that day. I made sure to be ready, figuring they'd come, drop it off, and be on their way. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The truck pulled up around 2 p.m., right on time. The delivery man was tall, wearing a uniform from the appliance company, and seemed friendly enough. He smiled at me when he got out of the truck, and we exchanged pleasantries as I showed him where I wanted the machine set up in the laundry room. I thought everything was fine. I really did. But then, after he unloaded the appliance, he said, "You mind if I come in and set it up for you?" I was a little taken aback because I hadn't expected it. I figured the company would just drop off the machine, and I'd have to handle the setup myself. But I didn't want to seem difficult. So I said, "Sure, I guess that would be helpful." I stepped aside to let him in. He carried the washing machine into the laundry room, set it down, and began looking around. He asked where the hookups were, which I showed him. Then, he started fiddling with the controls and asked me if I wanted him to connect it right away or if I'd rather wait. I said it was fine, go ahead, and I left him to it, figuring he knew what he was doing. That's when things started to get strange. As he worked, he began making small talk. It started innocently enough. "You live here alone?" he asked, glancing at me as I sat at the kitchen table, trying to get some work done. "Yeah," I answered, just trying to be polite. "It's just me." He nodded but didn't say anything for a while. Then, after a few moments, he added, "Do you have a boyfriend?" I looked up, surprised. The question seemed odd, but I brushed it off. "No," I said, trying to keep it casual. "Just not really into dating right now." He seemed to think about that for a moment, then nodded as if he was making some kind of decision. But then he said, "I'm sure a pretty girl like you must have some guys after you." I didn't know how to respond to that. I'm not someone who gets a lot of attention, and the comment felt off. But I forced a smile and nodded, saying something like, "Not really." He didn't seem to hear me. Instead, he kept on working, but he started asking more personal questions. "Do you live alone because you want to? Or are you just, like, avoiding someone?" I felt my skin prickle. His tone was different now. It wasn't just small talk anymore. It felt like he was prying, trying to get more information than necessary. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just a little awkward, but he kept going. "You've got a lot of stuff here," he remarked, glancing around my house. "Do you live here long? You seem settled." "I've been here a while," I replied, my voice getting tighter. I wanted to make him finish up and leave, but I didn't want to seem rude. Then, he asked something I really didn't expect. "Do you ever have people over? Or is it just you all the time?" The question made my stomach twist. It wasn't the kind of thing someone should be asking a stranger in your home. My mind raced for a way to end the conversation, but before I could respond, he added, "I don't want to sound like a creep, but it must get lonely sometimes, huh?" I froze. Something wasn't right. He was still working, but his body language had changed. He seemed more focused on me than the appliance now. I started to feel uncomfortable, like he was sizing me up, watching me too closely. I couldn't explain it, but I had this gut feeling that something was off. I tried to change the subject, making some excuse about needing to get back to work. But instead of just nodding and finishing the setup, he paused. He stood up straight and looked at me, not moving. There was something about the way he stared at me that made my chest tighten. "You're sure you're all right living here alone?" he asked again, his voice lower now. I can't help but wonder, sometimes people need help with things. I didn't know what he meant by that, but I could feel my heart rate picking up. I didn't like where this conversation was going, and I really wanted him to leave. But I didn't know how to tell him without being rude. He was in my house, and I didn't want to cause a scene, but I was scared. I could tell he wasn't going to leave anytime soon. I stood up abruptly, my voice firmer now. "Look, I appreciate your help with the machine, but I really need to get back to work. Can you finish up and head out?" He seemed startled by my change in tone. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He nodded and turned back to the machine, but I could tell he was stalling. He wasn't finishing up like he should have. Instead, he took his time, moving slowly as if he was trying to prolong the visit. "Almost done here," he said, but his voice sounded off. "Just need a little more time." I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over to the door of the laundry room and opened it wide. "No! You need to leave now." He looked at me, his face unreadable for a second. Then, he grabbed his tools and walked out of the room without another word. I stood there for a few seconds, frozen, just watching him walk out the front door. I didn't wait. As soon as the door closed behind him, I locked it. I didn't care if it was rude or not. I felt trapped in my own house. I don't know if he meant to harm me or if it was just an awkward, creepy encounter, but I was relieved when he finally left. The whole thing left me shaken. After that, I called the company to file a complaint. They were apologetic, but they couldn't really do anything since I'd already accepted the service. I've been extra careful ever since, making sure I don't let anyone into my house without a clear need. I don't know if I overreacted, but I can't shake the feeling that something bad could have happened if I didn't stand up for myself. I still get nervous when I hear someone knock on the door. I hired a contractor to fix my roof last fall. I'd been putting it off for a while, but after a big storm, water started dripping into the corner of my bedroom. I didn't have much choice anymore. I found the guy online, through one of those sites where you can check reviews. His ratings were decent, and he seemed professional when I talked to him on the phone. The first day he came by, everything was normal. He was in his early 40s, stocky, with a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in a while. His truck was full of tools, and he brought a ladder. He seemed to know what he was doing. We walked around the house while he pointed out some areas that might need work. He even said he could give me a discount since it didn't look like it'd take more than a few days. I work from home, so I was there while he worked on the roof. At first, it was fine. He'd knock on the door if he needed anything, like access to the attic or an outlet for his tools. He made small talk, asking what I did for work and if I lived alone. I didn't think much of it at the time, though I didn't answer the second question directly. I just said something vague about having family nearby. By the third day, the vibe started to shift. He showed up earlier than we'd agreed and stayed late, even after it was too dark to do much work. He'd knock on the door at random times to ask for water or to tell me something about the roof that didn't seem urgent. Once, he asked if he could use the bathroom, which I let him do, though it felt strange. After that, I noticed he lingered a bit too long inside before heading back out. That evening, I found him sitting on the back steps when I went to take out the trash. He wasn't working, just sitting there, drinking water from a bottle he must have brought himself. He looked up at me and smiled, but there was something off about it. It wasn't friendly. It felt knowing. "You're here by yourself a lot, huh?" he said, nodding toward the house. I didn't know how to respond, so I just said, "Not really," and went back inside. I locked the door behind me, something I hadn't done before during the day. The next morning, he showed up unannounced. I wasn't expecting him since he told me the night before that he'd be finishing up later in the week. When I asked why he was there, he said he'd noticed something on the roof he wanted to check. I didn't see any harm in it, so I let him. But as the day went on, he barely touched his tools. Instead, he kept knocking on the door with excuses to come inside. He needed to check the attic again. He thought he saw something wrong with the fence. He wanted to show me a part he said was damaged. Each time, I felt more uncomfortable. He wasn't doing anything blatantly wrong, but his questions were invasive. He asked if I had a boyfriend, if I'd lived here long, if I ever got scared being in such a quiet neighborhood. I started giving him shorter answers, hoping he'd get the hint. He didn't. That night, after he finally left, I called a friend and told her what was going on. She said I should trust my gut and maybe look for someone else to finish the job. I agreed, but I wasn't sure how to handle it. I didn't want to accuse him of anything without proof, and I also didn't want to cause a scene. The next day, he didn't show up. I felt relieved, thinking maybe he decided to move on to another job. But around 8 p.m., when it was already dark, I heard a knock at the door. My stomach dropped. I didn't have a peephole, so I called out, "Who's it?" "It's me," he said. "I just wanted to drop off some stuff I forgot to give you. For the roof." I didn't open the door. "You can leave it on the porch," I said. There was a pause. "I really need to explain it to you," he said. "It's important. I wouldn't want you to get the wrong materials." I told him I'd figure it out myself, but he didn't leave. He knocked again, harder this time. "Come on," he said, his voice less friendly now. "Just let me in for a minute. I won't stay long." My heart was pounding. I grabbed my phone and called my friend, keeping my voice low as I told her what was happening. She told me to call the police, but I hesitated. I didn't want to overreact. Still, I told the man I was on the phone with someone, hoping it would scare him off. It worked, at least for the moment. He muttered something I couldn't hear and walked away. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I called a different contractor to finish the job. I didn't tell them about the first guy, just that I wanted a second opinion. When they went up to the roof, they found tools the first guy had left behind. I decided not to contact him about it. A few days later, I saw his truck parked down the street while I was walking to the mailbox. He wasn't in it, but I knew it was his. I hurried back inside and locked the doors, pulling the curtains closed. He didn't come to the house again, but for weeks after, I kept seeing his truck around the neighborhood. I don't know if he was working nearby or if he was watching me. Either way, I haven't felt completely safe since. I ended up installing security cameras and telling my neighbors to keep an eye out. So far, nothing else has happened, but I still get nervous every time I hear a knock at the door. It was one of those rare afternoons where I had no plans. I just finished a couple of tests at school, and my parents were busy with work, so I decided to head to the mall to pick up a few things. Nothing big, just some new clothes and maybe some books. I'm not really a big shopper, but I figured I'd treat myself a little. The mall was relatively empty for a Friday, which made it feel a bit quieter than usual. I was wandering around the main floor, trying to find a pair of jeans that weren't too expensive but still looked good. It was a typical day. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, as I passed by the shoe store, I noticed a group of 3 adults. A man and 2 women, maybe in their 30s or early 40s. They were standing just outside the entrance, looking around. It wasn't the way they were standing that caught my attention, but the way they looked at me. It wasn't like a glance, like you'd expect from a stranger in a public place. No, they were staring at me. It felt wrong, but I tried not to think too much of it. I kept walking, glancing at the shoes in the window. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw them move, and before I knew it, they were standing right in front of me. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice a little too frantic for my taste. "Have you seen a little girl around here?" "About this tall," he motioned with his hand, "dark hair, pink jacket." "She's about 6 or 7. We've been looking everywhere." I don't know why, but something about the way he spoke made me feel uneasy. Maybe it was the fact that they looked calm enough, but there was this strange tension in the air. The man seemed rushed, but not in a way that made me feel like he was genuinely panicking. He was almost too calm. I mean, what kind of parent just walks up to a random teenager in a mall and starts asking about their missing child? No, sorry," I said, shaking my head. "I haven't seen anyone like that." The woman standing beside him nodded, and I thought she looked a little too relieved at my answer. She had this smile that felt forced, like she was trying to be polite, but something wasn't quite right. "Thank you. We can't find her anywhere. She wandered off and we're getting worried," she added, sounding almost rehearsed. The way she said it made me question if they were really parents at all. The other woman, who hadn't spoken yet, stepped forward, looking even more anxious. "We've been searching for a while, and we don't know where else to look." "It's just," she broke off mid-sentence and looked at the man, like they had some silent agreement. Then the man spoke again, his tone suddenly shifting, softer, but still just as urgent. "Hey, would you mind helping us out? We think she might have gone towards the exit, and if you could just check, maybe help us find her. We're not sure where else to go." I'm not sure what made me hesitate, but something did. I stood there, unsure. At that moment, a cold feeling ran through my chest. I glanced around, but the mall was still quiet. No one seemed to be paying attention. Maybe they were just desperate parents, I thought, trying to find their child. But why had they picked me? I should have just walked away. I should have just told them I didn't have time to help. But instead, I nodded. "Okay, I'll look around by the exit." The man smiled, a little too wide, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks. We really appreciate it." They all turned and started walking toward the far end of the mall, not saying anything else. I fell in line behind them. Something in the back of my mind told me that I should be cautious, but my curiosity and guilt took over. I kept thinking that maybe they really were just worried parents. It wasn't until we reached the escalators that I realized how far I'd followed them. The mall exit was on the ground floor, but we were heading toward the back entrance, where the service areas were. The further we walked, the more my unease grew. There were fewer people around, and the lights seemed dimmer in that part of the mall. It felt isolated. The noise of the crowd faded, and suddenly, it was just the 4 of us. The woman in front of me kept looking back, like she was checking to see if I was still there, but she never said anything. I tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right, but as we turned another corner, I realized I didn't even recognize where we were anymore. I stopped in my tracks. "This isn't the exit," I said, my voice a little shakier than I wanted it to be. "I thought we were going to the exit." The man turned, his face unreadable. "Oh, it's just a shortcut. We're close." I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The whole situation was starting to feel wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Why hadn't they just gone to the front exit like any normal person? Why had they led me here? Before I could backtrack, the woman ahead of me stopped and looked over her shoulder at me, her smile vanishing. She took a step closer. "It's just a bit further, don't worry. We'll find her. Just keep going." I started to feel trapped. They were walking so slowly now, and the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. No one was around. The silence was deafening. Something clicked in my mind, and the realization hit me all at once: these weren't parents looking for a lost child. They were luring me somewhere. I didn't know why it took me so long to realize it, but I had to get out of there. I turned quickly and started walking back toward the escalators, but before I could get very far, I heard the man's voice, low and urgent, behind me. "Hey, what's the rush?" he asked, his voice changing. "We're just trying to help you help us." I didn't look back. I just kept walking faster, breaking into a jog as I passed the service doors, heading back toward the main part of the mall. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from them. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab my shoulder, pulling me back. My heart raced in my chest, but before I could react, a voice yelled from down the hall. "Security." I turned and saw a mall security guard running toward us. The man immediately let go of my shoulder and stepped back, his expression cold, almost angry. The woman and the other man just stood there, their faces suddenly blank. The security guard was fast, and within moments, they had them surrounded. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and ran the rest of the way out into the main area of the mall where people were talking and shopping. I could hear the guard calling out, telling me to stay put, but I just needed to get away from them. I never saw those people again, but I was shaken. It took me weeks to feel normal again, to trust that when I saw someone in public asking for help, I wouldn't instantly be reminded of that moment. It wasn't until later, when I was talking to one of my friends, that I realized just how lucky I was. Apparently, there had been a series of similar incidents at local malls over the past few months, people getting lured into quiet, isolated areas and disappearing. No one knew exactly what happened, but I guess I just got out in time. I don't go to that part of the mall anymore. I still think about it sometimes, and I've learned to trust that gut feeling that something's wrong, even if it's just a small voice in the back of my head. It was the one thing that saved me. It started on Wednesday morning, one of those quiet days where nothing seems out of place. I was home alone, working in my makeshift office near the front of the house. The neighborhood was still, with most people off at work or school. The only sounds were the occasional car passing by and the faint hum of the heater kicking in. Around 10 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Not a casual tap-tap, but 3 firm knocks. It startled me enough that I jumped, spilling some coffee onto my desk. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the doorbell hadn't rung. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won out. When I opened the door, a man stood on the porch. He was middle-aged, clean-shaven, and dressed in a plain button-up shirt and slacks. He carried a clipboard and wore a badge clipped to his pocket. The badge looked official enough, though I couldn't make out what it said from where I stood. "Good morning," he said with a polite smile. "Sorry to bother you. I'm with the city's survey department. We're conducting property evaluations in the area, and I just need to confirm a few details about your home." His tone was professional, his demeanor calm. There was nothing inherently alarming about him, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was how he kept glancing past me, like he was trying to look inside the house. "Ah, sure," I said, hesitantly. "What do you need to know?" He looked down at his clipboard and flipped through a few papers. "I just need to verify some basic information. Number of bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage, things like that. It's for the city records." I hesitated. Wouldn't that information already be on file? His smile didn't falter, but there was a slight pause before he answered. "Sometimes the records aren't updated accurately. It's just a quick confirmation." I didn't love the idea of giving out details about my house to a stranger, even one claiming to be from the city. "Do you have any identification?" I asked, keeping my hand on the door. "Of course," he said, reaching for the badge on his pocket. He held it up, but not close enough for me to see it clearly. "See? Official surveyor. I can give you a contact number if you'd like to confirm." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. His badge looked generic, the kind you could order online. The name on it didn't match the department logo. My gut told me this wasn't right, and I decided to trust it. "I'm sorry," I said firmly, "but I'm not comfortable sharing information about my home. If you need anything, you can contact me through the proper channels." His smile faded, and his expression shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't anger, but something colder. "All right," he said after a moment, his tone still polite but clipped. "No problem. Have a good day." He turned and walked away, heading down the driveway toward the street. I watched him go, noting how he didn't stop at any of my neighbors' houses. He just got into a gray sedan parked a few houses down and drove off. I stood there for a moment, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that settled over me. The encounter didn't sit right, but I convinced myself it was probably nothing. Maybe he was legit, and I'd just been overly cautious. Better safe than sorry, I told myself. That night, I locked the doors and windows as usual. I double-checked everything, even though I didn't always do that. It wasn't paranoia, I told myself, just being careful. The next morning, I found the back gate open. It wasn't broken or hanging off its hinges, just unlatched. I knew I had closed it the day before because I'd let the dog out after lunch. I always made a point to latch it afterward. I walked around the yard, looking for anything out of place. That's when I noticed faint footprints in the dirt near the side of the house. They were too big to be mine and too fresh to be old. I knelt down to get a better look, and my heart sank. They led straight to one of the windows. The window screen had been tampered with. It wasn't torn, but it had been partially pried away from the frame. Whoever did it didn't get inside. The window was still locked, but the attempt was clear. Someone had been here. My mind immediately went to the city surveyor from the day before. His questions, his clipboard, the way he looked past me into the house, it all clicked. He wasn't from the city. He had been scouting my home, testing whether I'd be an easy target. I called the police and filed a report. The officer who came to the house listened carefully as I described the man and what had happened. He nodded as I spoke, his expression grim. "This isn't the first time we've heard about something like this," he said. "There's been a few reports of people posing as utility workers or city officials to gain access to homes. He took down all the details I could remember, the man's appearance, his car, the fake badge, and assured me they'd investigate. But there wasn't much they could do without more information. Just be vigilant, he said before leaving. If you see him again, call us immediately. For the next few days, I felt like I was living in a bubble of paranoia. Every noise outside made me jump. I kept all the blinds closed and checked the locks multiple times a day. I even installed a camera above the front door, something I'd been meaning to do for months but had always put off. Then, a week later, I spotted the gray sedan parked down the street again. It was the same car, I was sure of it. It sat there for hours, the windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the car was gone. I haven't seen the man since, but the experience has stayed with me. It's the kind of thing that makes you question everything, that makes you second-guess every knock at the door. I still don't know what he was planning, but I'm grateful I trusted my instincts that day. It might have saved me from something far worse. I had just finished a long day at work and wanted to grab a few things from the grocery store before heading home. It was late in the evening, around 8:30 p.m., and the store was quieter than usual, with only a handful of people scattered around the aisles. I was tired but just trying to get in and out as quickly as possible. I didn't think much of the empty shelves or the dimmed lights, just focused on my list and getting home. As I moved through the aisles, something caught my eye. A man was walking just a few paces behind me. I didn't pay much attention at first. It wasn't unusual to see people in the same aisles when you're picking out groceries. But then it happened again. I rounded the corner to the next aisle, and so did he, right behind me, just a few feet away. It wasn't anything too obvious, but I started to feel watched. A little uncomfortable. I picked up a box of cereal and glanced over my shoulder. He was still there. Not directly looking at me, but I could feel his presence. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I moved on, heading towards the produce section. I reached for some tomatoes and noticed him again, only this time he was standing a little too close to me. I could feel the air shift, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickly looked down at my cart, pretending to rummage through it. He was still there, and this time, it wasn't subtle. I kept telling myself to stay calm. This was a grocery store, after all. People shop, and maybe he was just trying to pick up some items too. But the way he was lingering was starting to feel wrong. I didn't recognize him from the store, and I couldn't remember seeing him earlier in the aisles. I kept glancing around the store, trying to see if anyone else had noticed him, but no one seemed to be paying attention. It was just the two of us, and I began to feel like I was trapped in some kind of vacuum, the space around me growing smaller with every step I took. I grabbed what I needed, trying to keep moving, trying to stay focused on my list. But each time I turned down a new aisle, there he was always just a few steps behind. Sometimes he would stop, pretending to look at a shelf, and then start walking again when I did. At one point, I reached for a bag of flour, and when I straightened up, he was right there. Too close. "Excuse me," I muttered, trying to sound confident, though my voice was shaking slightly. He just smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was unsettling, almost as if he knew something I didn't. "Sorry," he said, his voice flat. He stepped aside, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than was comfortable before he moved to the next aisle. I felt the blood drain from my face. My heart started pounding in my chest. I hurried to finish my shopping, grabbing the last few items as quickly as I could, trying not to glance back. I just wanted to get to the checkout, get out of there, and go home. When I finally made my way to the register, I noticed the man again, standing in line a few spots behind me. This time, I made sure not to look back at him, but I could feel his presence, like a shadow on the back of my neck. I paid quickly, practically running through the checkout process. The cashier didn't seem to notice anything, or maybe they were just too busy with their own work. I didn't care. I left the store, trying to stay calm, to look casual. My mind was racing, and I could hear my footsteps echoing on the pavement as I walked to my car. It wasn't until I reached the end of the row that I saw him again, standing by his car, just a few spots over from mine. My stomach dropped. I couldn't remember what kind of car he drove, but there it was, a sedan with tinted windows, parked next to my own. I didn't know for sure if he was waiting for me, but something told me that he was. I stopped in my tracks. I didn't want to seem like I was panicking, but I could feel the dread creeping up my spine. I wasn't sure what to do. I couldn't just go back into the store. I couldn't go back to the register and make a scene. I needed to get to my car, but I was too scared to walk towards it now. I stood there for a moment, pretending to adjust my purse and looking around to see if anyone else was still in the parking lot. The place was nearly empty now. I could see a couple of cars far off in the distance, but no one close. The parking lot was eerily quiet. My pulse was thudding in my ears. I checked my phone quickly, no messages. No calls. I glanced back at the man. He was still standing there, facing away from me, but I knew he had to have seen me by now. He hadn't gotten into his car. He hadn't moved an inch. Just waiting. Watching. I thought about calling someone, but my hands were shaking. I didn't want to make any rash decisions and risk alerting him that I was onto him. I tried to breathe through the anxiety rising in my chest. I could feel the panic beginning to build, but I forced myself to move. Slowly, I stepped back toward my car, making my way down the row of vehicles, keeping my eyes fixed ahead of me. I felt like every step took forever. When I was just a few feet away from my car, I hesitated. Was he really going to do something? Was he just waiting for me to get close enough? I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew I had to get in my car, fast. I reached for my keys, keeping my eyes fixed on his car. I unlocked the door and slid inside, locking it immediately. My hands were still shaking, and I could barely get the key into the ignition. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but the parking lot was empty. He wasn't there anymore. My heart was racing in my chest as I finally started the engine and backed out of the space. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. It wasn't until I got inside my apartment and locked the door that I felt like I could breathe again. But even then, I kept thinking about that man. The way he followed me, the way he just stood there waiting by his car. The sick feeling in my stomach didn't go away until well into the night. I didn't go out again alone for the next few days. I stayed home, and even when I did go out, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching me. I don't know if that man was just looking for someone to talk to or if he had other intentions, but I wasn't willing to stick around long enough to find out. I've always considered myself a fairly aware person, someone who trusts their instincts when something feels off. But that doesn't mean I'm always right. And it certainly didn't help me the day I encountered the man at my front door. It started as an ordinary Thursday. I was working from home that day, sitting at my desk with my headphones in, trying to power through a stack of emails. The neighborhood was quiet, as it usually is in the middle of the day. There weren't many cars driving by, and most people were at work. I didn't expect any interruptions, but of course, life rarely goes as planned. I was just about to open my email inbox when I heard a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated. I checked the time. It was just past noon, and no one usually stopped by unannounced. Still, I figured it was maybe a delivery, or perhaps someone from the neighborhood with a question. I got up and peeked through the peephole. There was a man standing on my porch, holding a clipboard. He was dressed in dark blue work clothes that looked official, with a utility company's logo on the sleeve. At least, that's what I thought I saw from the peephole. I opened the door slightly, keeping the chain lock on. "Hello?" I asked, not fully opening it. "Good afternoon," the man said in a calm, neutral voice. "I'm from the gas company. We're conducting some routine safety checks in the area, and there's been a report of a gas leak nearby. Just want to make sure everything's good on your end. Mind if I come in for a few minutes to check your system?" His demeanor seemed normal enough, nothing overtly suspicious. In fact, he even looked polite, like someone doing his job. I briefly wondered if maybe it was just some routine maintenance or if they were trying to get everyone's systems up to code. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I don't know if it was the way he looked at me, or how quickly he rattled off his explanation. But my gut told me to be cautious. However, I told myself I was overthinking it. I had utility workers in my house before, and they all had done their jobs without issue. So, against my better judgment, I nodded. "Sure, okay," I said, opening the door wider. "Just give me a second." I went to take the chain lock off, but before I could, he pushed the door open slightly more, just enough to slip inside. He didn't rush in, but he didn't wait for an invitation either. "Thanks," he said, as though he'd been invited in already. His voice had shifted slightly, and it made me tense up. I couldn't explain it. Something wasn't right. I'll just need a minute," I said, trying to keep my composure. "I just need to grab my phone, and I'll be right with you." I was hoping to buy some time. Maybe I could call the utility company to double check, but as I turned to walk into the living room, I heard the sound of the door clicking shut behind me. My heart skipped. It wasn't the usual sound of the door closing, it was unmistakably the sound of the door locking. I spun around quickly, already feeling a cold rush of panic. The man was standing there, looking calm, almost too calm. "Is everything all right? You seem a little tense." My blood turned cold. "What do you mean, the door is locked?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a precaution," he said with a half smile, though there was no real warmth behind it. "You wouldn't want any issues with your gas, would you?" He took a step further into the house without waiting for an answer. I wasn't sure what to do, but my instinct screamed at me to get out, to get away from him, to run. I knew the door was locked behind me, and I had no idea if he had locked it himself or if he had some key. "Can you please unlock the door?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He ignored me, continuing to step further inside like he was familiar with the house. "Just wanted to check a few things." He moved past me, into the kitchen. I could feel the air in the room shift, the tension building in my chest. I told myself I was overreacting, but my gut was telling me something else entirely. He opened the kitchen cabinets and began to inspect them, as if it was part of his job. It was too odd. The gas lines were outside, right? Why would he need to look around the house? I stared at him, trying to come up with a plan. Was this guy really a worker, or was something far worse happening? I needed to do something, anything, to get control of the situation. But what? I didn't want to confront him directly, not when I had no idea what he could do. I could tell he wasn't acting normal anymore. His actions were deliberate and methodical. He wasn't here to check the gas. He was here for something else. I took a step toward the door, my hand brushing against the wall as I prepared to make a break for it. But before I could move, he turned to face me. "I should probably check upstairs," he said, with that same unsettling calm. "You wouldn't want any surprises, right?" I froze. My pulse quickened. My mind was racing. I had to stop him from going upstairs. He couldn't get to the second floor, where my bedroom was, where I kept my phone. "No," I said, a little too firmly. "No, there's no need to go upstairs. I have a gas detector in the basement. It's just down there. It's fine." He looked at me for a second, then smiled again, but this time it wasn't friendly at all. "If you say so," he said, his voice dropping lower. "I'll just have a quick look upstairs. You know, for safety." I was done. This wasn't happening. I made a quick decision. Without saying another word, I turned and bolted for the front door. I had to get out. I had to get away from this man. As I reached the door, I fumbled with the lock, trying to turn it. I heard him behind me, his footsteps quickening, but I didn't dare turn around. The door finally opened, and I stumbled out onto the porch, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the neighbor's house, pounding on their door with everything I had. They let me in, and I quickly explained what had happened. My neighbor, thankfully, called the police immediately. The man never came back, and the police couldn't find any sign of him when they checked the area, but they assured me that he wasn't a utility worker. He didn't have any identification. I still don't know who that man was or what he wanted. But I learned my lesson that day. You don't just trust anyone who knocks at your door, no matter what they claim. And you definitely don't let them inside. I've taken extra precautions since then. Deadbolts, security cameras, and a new routine. I can't risk that feeling again. I just wish I knew what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. It happened on a stretch of highway I've driven more times than I can count. It's one of those roads that feels endless, surrounded by flat fields, no landmarks, nothing to break the monotony. The kind of road where the sky feels too big, and you start counting the minutes until you're off it. It was late, maybe 10 or 11 at night. I was driving back from visiting a friend a couple of towns over. I had the radio low and the windows cracked open to keep myself awake. There weren't many cars out, just me, the occasional truck, and a dark sky that felt heavier than usual. At first, I didn't notice the car behind me. It was just headlights in the distance, blending in like they always do. But after a while, I realized they weren't getting any closer or farther away. They stayed there, hanging back at the same distance no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just keeping a steady pace, like I was. But the more I watched them in the rearview mirror, the more I felt like something was off. Every time I switched lanes, they did the same, like they were copying me. I decided to test it. I slowed down, almost to a crawl for the highway, to see if they would pass me. They didn't. Instead, they slowed down too, keeping the same distance. My heart started to pick up then. I wasn't scared yet, but I was definitely on edge. I tried to shake them off by speeding up again, going a little faster than I was comfortable with. For a second, I thought it worked. Their headlights faded back a little, and I thought they finally decided to stop tailing me. But then, they sped up too, closing the gap. That was when I knew something was wrong. This wasn't normal. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe they were just heading the same direction, and I was overthinking it. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I glanced at the GPS and saw there was an exit coming up in a couple of miles. It wasn't the one I needed, but I decided to take it anyway. If they followed me, I'd know for sure. The exit was one of those lonely off-ramps that dumps you onto a smaller road surrounded by nothing but darkness. As I took the turn, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping to see them continue down the highway. They didn't. The car followed me, turning onto the same road. That was when the fear really hit me. My hands felt slick on the steering wheel, and my chest was tight. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. The smaller road was even emptier than the highway. No streetlights, no cars, just a faint glow of my headlights and theirs. I thought about pulling over to let them pass, but something about the way they were driving made me think that wasn't a good idea. I kept going, trying to stay calm and think straight. The car behind me started getting closer, their headlights brighter in my mirror. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, my whole body bracing for something. Then, out of nowhere, they sped up and swerved into the next lane, coming up beside me. I glanced over and saw a man in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out much, just a shadowy figure with one hand on the wheel, staring straight ahead. He didn't look at me, but the way his car drifted closer to mine felt deliberate. He was trying to push me off the road. Panic set in. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to keep my car steady as it kept edging closer. I honked my horn, hoping it would scare him off or at least make him back off. It didn't. He stayed right there, his car inches from mine, forcing me toward the shoulder. I tried to speed up, but he matched my pace. I couldn't go any faster without losing control. My car started to drift toward the gravel at the side of the road, and I felt the tires start to slip. I swerved back into the lane, barely missing him, and he fell back for a moment. I thought maybe he'd given up, but then he was right there again, this time coming up behind me. His headlights filled my mirrors, blinding me, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. There were no other cars around. No gas stations or stores, nothing but darkness and an endless road. I kept driving, hoping to see some kind of sign or turnoff where I could get away. Then I saw a narrow side road coming up on the left. It wasn't marked, just a gap in the trees that looked like it might go somewhere. I didn't have a plan, but I took it. I yanked the wheel and turned hard, the tires screeching as I veered off the main road. The side road was rough, gravel kicking up under my tires, but I kept going. I glanced in the mirror and saw the other car hesitate for a second before following me. My heart sank. He wasn't giving up. The road twisted and turned, narrowing as it went. I couldn't go as fast as I wanted without risking a crash. The other car stayed close, his headlights bouncing in my mirror, but he wasn't trying to push me anymore. I wondered if he was waiting for me to make a mistake, to slow down or stop. Then I saw it, a small clearing up ahead with a cluster of houses. Relief flooded me. I didn't care whose house it was. I just needed to get to where someone could see me. I gunned the engine and pulled into the driveway of the first house I saw, slamming the brakes and throwing the car into park. The other car stopped at the edge of the clearing, just sitting there with its headlights on. I jumped out of my car and ran to the front door of the house, banging on it and yelling for help. It felt like an eternity before someone answered. An older man opened the door, looking confused and alarmed. I barely managed to get the words out, telling him someone was following me, trying to run me off the road. He stepped outside and looked toward the driveway, but the car was gone. I stood there, shaking and trying to catch my breath, while he called the police. They came and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. I didn't get a good look at the driver, and there were no cameras on the road where it happened. I don't drive that stretch of highway at night anymore. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I can't stop thinking about how deliberate it all felt. He wasn't just messing around. He was trying to scare me, or worse. It was late, maybe around 9 or 10 p.m., when my car broke down on Route 17. I was headed back home after visiting my sister, and it was one of those stretches of highway with nothing but fields and trees on either side. The nearest town was at least 20 miles back, and my phone had barely a single bar of service. I was trying not to panic, but the thought of sitting there all night wasn't exactly comforting. I popped the hood and stared at the engine like I knew what I was looking at. I didn't. Everything seemed fine to me, but the car wouldn't start. The battery was new, and I had gas, so I couldn't figure out what the problem was. I tried calling for roadside assistance, but the call wouldn't go through. That's when I saw the headlights. They came up slow, like whoever was driving was being careful. I stood by my car, waving my arms to make sure they saw me. A truck pulled over to the side, an older model, maybe from the 80s or 90s. The driver got out, a tall man with a thick build, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had a calm, steady way about him. "You all right?" he asked, his voice deep and even. "My car just died," I said. "I can't figure out what's wrong, and my phone's not working." He nodded and walked over to my car without another word. He leaned over the engine, fiddling with a couple of things while I stood off to the side. After a minute, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket. "Looks like it might be the fuel pump," he said. "You're not going anywhere tonight." I felt my stomach drop. "What should I do?" "Well," he said, "I've got a garage not far from here. I can tow you there. Take a closer look." I hesitated. Something about him made me uneasy, but I didn't have many options. It was either him or wait for someone else to come by, and who knew how long that would take. "All right," I said finally. He went back to his truck and pulled out a tow chain, hooking it up to my car. The whole time, he didn't say much. I tried to make small talk, asking if he lived nearby, but his answers were short, almost clipped. The ride to his garage wasn't long, maybe 10 minutes, but it felt longer. We turned off the main road onto a dirt path that wound through the trees. There weren't any lights except for his headlights, and the further we went, the darker it got. I started to regret my decision, but it was too late to back out. The garage was a small, run-down building with peeling paint and a single overhead light that flickered. He unhooked my car and waved me toward the entrance. "Come on in," he said. "I'll take a look." I followed him inside, and my unease grew. The place was cluttered with old tools, car parts, and a thick layer of dust. There was a smell, too oil mixed with something sour. He motioned for me to sit on a worn-out chair near the wall while he pulled the hood of my car open again. I tried to stay calm, but the way he moved felt off. He wasn't really looking at the engine, just sort of going through the motions. I noticed his eyes darting toward me every so often, like he was checking to see if I was watching him. "Do you have any family nearby?" he asked suddenly. "No," I said. "Why?" "Just making conversation," he said, his tone flat. I shifted in my seat, feeling the tension in the air. I glanced toward the door, calculating how far I'd have to run to get to it if something went wrong. He closed the hood and turned to face me. "Fuel pump shot," he said. "I can order the part, but it'll take a day or two." "I can call someone to pick me up," I said, standing. "Thanks for your help." "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold now. "Your phone doesn't work, remember?" I froze. The way he said it wasn't a suggestion, it was a statement. I forced myself to smile, trying to act like I wasn't scared. "I'll just wait outside," I said, moving toward the door. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You're staying here," he said. "It's not safe out there at night." My heart was pounding now. I tried to step around him, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was strong, and his eyes had a strange intensity. "Let go of me," I said, my voice shaking. He didn't. Instead, he pulled me back toward the chair and pushed me into it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. I didn't wait to see what he meant. I twisted out of his grip and ran for the door. He shouted something behind me, but I didn't stop. I made it outside and sprinted toward the trees. My legs were burning, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't dare slow down. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel. He was faster than I expected, and I knew I couldn't outrun him. I spotted a thick cluster of bushes and dove into them, crouching low and trying to quiet my breathing. He stopped nearby, his footsteps slowing. I could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and angry. He walked past my hiding spot, and I waited until I couldn't hear him anymore before I moved. I crept through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance. I ran toward the road and flagged down a passing car. The driver was an older woman, and she took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She didn't ask questions, just told me to get in. She drove me to the nearest town, where I called the police. They found my car at the garage, but the man was gone. They said the place had been abandoned for years, and they'd had reports of strange activity in the area before. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I've never driven that stretch of highway again. It started a week ago, but I still can't get the images out of my head. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget what happened. I had surgery. Nothing too serious, just a routine procedure, but it left me needing a few days of recovery at the hospital. My doctor assured me that everything would be fine. It wasn't a big hospital, not the kind you see in the city, but one of those smaller ones that's out in the country, more isolated. The kind of place where everyone knows each other, and the staff are familiar with every patient that walks through the door. I wasn't worried. After the surgery, I was groggy, mostly asleep, and I didn't notice much. But I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, and I realized something was off. My room felt different. The lights were dim, but the place felt too quiet. Too still. At first, I thought maybe it was just the after effects of the anesthesia, but as I looked around, I realized something wasn't right. There was someone sitting at the far side of the room, near the window, just staring at me. I couldn't make out the details, but I could see the shape of a person hunched over, their face in shadows. My heart raced, and I tried to sit up, but the pain from the surgery shot through my chest. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. I wasn't sure what to expect, but the person didn't answer. They just sat there, motionless. My throat was dry, and I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I thought maybe it was a nurse or someone from the hospital just checking in on me, but the silence was unnerving. After a few moments, the person shifted slightly. I could make out the faint outline of handcuffs on their wrists. That's when the panic set in. I was alone with someone who had been restrained. That's when I heard a faint shuffle and the jangle of metal. I tried to call out again, but nothing came out. My throat was too dry. I could barely move, still recovering from the surgery, and now my mind was racing with questions. Why was someone in handcuffs here? Why hadn't anyone told me about this? The person moved slightly. I could feel my heart in my throat as I watched the shadows. I tried to stay calm, but I could hear the faint clink of metal every time they shifted in their seat. I needed help. I needed to get out of there. My instinct was to press the nurse call button, but when I reached for it, I realized the cord had been cut. That's when I started to panic. I tried to look around the room, my vision still blurry from the meds, but the silence was suffocating. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The door to my room, which was supposed to be locked for safety, was ajar. And that's when I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps approaching. My blood ran cold. I tried to force myself to stand, but the pain from my stitches was too much. Every movement felt like my body was on fire. I froze, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound that would indicate help was near. The footsteps stopped. The person at the window was still, but I could sense their attention shifting. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, but I couldn't make myself look directly at them. My breath was shallow now, and I realized the situation was far worse than I had initially thought. Whoever this was, this person locked up and sitting in my hospital room wasn't supposed to be here. That's when I heard the voice, low and gravelly. It was like a whisper, but it carried enough to send a chill down my spine. "Stay quiet," the voice said, barely above a whisper. I froze. My instinct screamed at me to call for help, but I knew it would be useless. There was no one coming. I was alone. I don't know how long we stayed like that. The silence was unbearable. My only focus was the handcuffs, the metallic sound, the person in my room. My thoughts raced through possibilities, none of them good. Then it happened. The lights went out. The whole hospital went dark, and all I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat and the distant hum of the emergency generator kicking in. The power failure was brief, just long enough to leave the entire building in pitch black darkness. It was enough to make everything seem even more sinister. I could hear the person standing up now, moving in the dark, footsteps coming closer. I felt my entire body freeze in terror. Then the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against the floor reached my ears, and the person moved closer. "Stay down," they whispered again, this time with a little more force. I barely had time to react before the door to my room slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. Someone entered, loud, deliberate footsteps. It was one of the police officers, and I couldn't tell whether they were here to help or if they were part of what was going on. "Is everything okay in here?" the officer asked, voice heavy with suspicion, but he didn't come into the room. The person in the shadows, the one in handcuffs, spoke again, their voice shaking slightly now. "Get me out of here," they demanded, not in a whisper this time. Their voice was more commanding, urgent. "I can't do that," the officer responded, his tone firm but unsure. "You're not going anywhere." For a moment, the room was still. Then, without warning, the figure lunged forward. There was a scuffle. The sound of metal clanging, followed by a scream. I couldn't see anything. I was paralyzed, trapped in the bed, too terrified to move. I heard the officer shout, then a gunshot. The crack of it echoed through the room, but the silence that followed was worse than anything. I could feel something was wrong, but I couldn't see anything. My mind couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The officer came in finally, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, and I saw him kneeling beside me. He was saying something, but I couldn't hear it over the ringing in my ears. I was moved quickly after that, taken to another room. The doctor came in to check on me, but I was still too disoriented to make sense of it all. Later, I learned the full story. The person who had been in my room wasn't just any criminal. They were violent, dangerous, and had been caught on charges I didn't want to know. The officer had been keeping them in my room by mistake. They'd been placed in the wrong ward. The power outage had been the perfect opportunity for them to escape, except they didn't expect the officer to intervene. But by then, it was too late for me. I couldn't erase the memory of that night, the feeling of being trapped in a room with someone who should never have been there. It took weeks for me to feel safe again. And I still don't trust hospitals. The whole thing still feels unreal. But it happened, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forget it. I always liked running early in the morning. It was quiet, the air felt fresh, and the streets were mostly empty. My usual route took me through a small park about a mile from my apartment. It wasn't big, just a couple of winding paths, some benches, and a lot of trees, but it was peaceful, especially at that time of day. I'd been running there for months and never had any issues. That morning felt like any other. It was just past 5:30 a.m., and the sun was barely starting to rise. I had my usual playlist going, the one I always used to get into a rhythm. The streets were still dark, and the only people I saw were the occasional dog walkers or another runner here and there. When I reached the park, I turned onto the main path, letting my feet fall into their usual pace. I noticed him about halfway through the park. He was standing near a bench, just off the path. At first, I thought he was waiting for someone. He wasn't doing anything, no phone, no dog, nothing. Just standing there, looking straight ahead. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about the way he stood caught my attention. Too still. Too rigid. I kept running, telling myself not to overthink it. Plenty of people use the park, and not everyone looks friendly first thing in the morning. As I got closer, I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He wasn't looking straight ahead anymore. He was looking at me. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept going. I didn't slow down, didn't change my pace. Just kept running. My music was still playing, but I turned the volume down low so I could hear if he said or did anything. He didn't move as I passed, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. About 20 steps past him, I looked over my shoulder, trying to be casual about it. He was still standing there, but now he had turned around. He was watching me. I told myself to focus. It was early, and maybe he was just out for a walk and curious about someone running by. I'd seen plenty of people in the park who seemed out of place. It didn't mean anything. But then I heard it, footsteps. At first, I thought it might just be someone else entering the park from another direction. I told myself not to panic, not to assume. But when I glanced back again, I saw him. He was walking now, heading in the same direction I was. Not running, not rushing. Just walking. He wasn't close, maybe 50 feet behind me, but he was there. I sped up a little, trying to create more distance between us. I told myself to stick to my route, not to change anything. If he was just walking, I'd be out of the park before he could get anywhere near me. I reached the end of the path and took the usual left turn toward the exit. When I glanced back again, he had turned too. My heart was pounding now, harder than it should have been from just running. I wasn't winded, but I felt like I couldn't breathe. I told myself to stay calm, to keep running, to act like nothing was wrong. But every time I looked back, he was still there. Always just far enough that it felt like I couldn't say anything or confront him, but close enough that I couldn't shake him. When I finally exited the park, I felt a small wave of relief. The street ahead was wider, brighter. A few cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the early morning gloom. I thought about stopping, waiting for him to pass, but something told me that would be worse. I didn't want him to know I was scared. I kept running, heading toward the busier part of my route. There was a gas station about a quarter mile up. It was small, but the lights were always on, and there was usually someone inside. I decided I'd stop there if he was still following me. I didn't have to look back anymore. I could hear his footsteps now. They were steady, matching my pace. Not speeding up, not slowing down. Just following. When I reached the gas station, I didn't hesitate. I turned sharply and went straight inside. The man behind the counter looked up, surprised to see someone this early. I walked to the back, pretending to grab a bottle of water, but really just trying to catch my breath. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I stayed back there for a minute or two before glancing toward the door. He was standing outside. He wasn't looking in, just standing by the edge of the parking lot, like he was waiting for me to come out. His hands were in his pockets, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was listening for something. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the gas station forever, but I didn't want to leave while he was still there. The man behind the counter asked if I needed help, and I almost told him what was going on. But what could he do? Call the police because someone was walking behind me? After a few minutes, the man outside moved. He didn't leave, just shifted closer to the building, standing by the corner where I couldn't see him unless I walked out. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I walked to the counter and told the clerk there was a man outside who had been following me. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the fear in it. The clerk frowned, looking toward the door, then nodded. He told me to stay inside while he went to check. I watched as he stepped out, looking around. The man was gone. The clerk came back in and told me there was no one there, but I could tell he believed me. He asked if I needed him to call someone or if I wanted to wait for a ride. I nodded, pulling out my phone to call a friend. I didn't care that it was early. I just needed someone to pick me up. While I waited, I stayed near the counter, my eyes glued to the parking lot. My friend showed up about 10 minutes later, and I ran straight to their car, not looking back. I told them everything on the ride home, and they insisted on staying with me for the rest of the day. I didn't go running for a while after that. When I finally did, I chose a different route, one with more people and fewer places to hide. But even now, I can't shake the feeling of those footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate, like they were waiting for something. Like he was waiting for something. I still can't shake the memory of what happened. It's been months now, but every time I close my eyes, I can see it all over again. The pain, the terror, the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I'm not sure I'll ever get over it. It was just supposed to be a quick camping trip, something simple, just to get away from the noise of the city for a weekend. I've always enjoyed the solitude of the woods, so when I found a quiet spot, I knew it'd be perfect. No one else around for miles, just the sounds of nature and the comfort of my tent. I set up my camp near a small stream and spent the day walking around, familiarizing myself with the area. It was about the third day when I decided to go off trail, just to explore a little. The woods were thick with trees, the ground soft underfoot, and it felt like the kind of place you could easily get lost in if you didn't know what you were doing. But I didn't mind. I wasn't going far, and I had a good sense of direction. My plan was simple: walk for a while, maybe find a nice spot for photos, and then head back. I had been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed something strange. The underbrush started to thin out, and I could see the ground was uneven, almost like something had disturbed it recently. At first, I didn't think much of it. Animals, maybe, or some weather erosion. But then, I stepped on something that didn't feel right underfoot. It was a rope, thin and tight, hidden beneath the leaves. Before I could process what was happening, the rope pulled, and I felt a sharp, brutal pain shoot up my leg. I screamed out and instinctively tried to pull away, but it was too late. The trap had already triggered. I looked down and saw that a thick metal clasp had closed around my ankle, the pressure unbearable, and I could feel something sharp digging into my skin. Blood was starting to drip, and I couldn't move. Panic flooded my chest, and I knew I had to get out of it, but my mind was racing. I looked around, but all I saw were trees, more trees. No one around. I tried to yank my foot free, but it was useless. The pain was almost too much to bear, and I could feel myself starting to lose control. What kind of trap was this? It wasn't a bear trap. The metal was thinner, more like something set for smaller animals, maybe a snare? But it was too heavy for something meant for an animal that small. And the fact that it was hidden so well made me think it wasn't just a hunting trap. I managed to calm myself enough to think, forcing myself to breathe deeply. I wasn't going to die here, not like this. I wasn't going to just give up. I looked around, trying to find anything that could help me. The trap was tight, and there was no way to loosen it. But there had to be a way to get out. I realized that I needed to stay calm. The more I panicked, the more it would hurt. But the longer I stayed in that spot, the more dangerous it became. I knew I was alone out here, at least, I thought I was. The woods were vast, and I was a good distance from camp. The trap could have been set by anyone. But then it hit me. I wasn't just injured. I was alone. I had no way to get help. And there was no telling who had set the trap or if they were still nearby. I tested the trap again, trying to move my leg, but it was useless. The more I moved, the worse the pain became, and I could feel the blood pooling around my ankle. I was losing time. Whoever set this trap, they could be watching me right now. Or worse, they could be coming to finish what they started. I thought about the knife I had in my pack, just a few feet away. It wasn't the best tool for the job, but it was something. It was the only thing I had. I tried to reach for it, but every movement caused the trap to tighten even more. I gritted my teeth, determined not to give in to the pain. I couldn't afford to panic. I had to get the knife. It took what felt like hours, but finally, I managed to grab the knife from my bag. I knew it wouldn't cut the metal, but maybe I could use it to loosen the mechanism somehow. It was a long shot, but it was the only thing I could think of. I struggled with it for what felt like forever, sweat pouring down my face, my breath shallow and erratic. Every second I wasted was another second closer to being completely helpless. Just as I thought I might pass out from the pain, I heard it. A snap of a twig behind me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to listen, but the forest was too quiet. I turned my head as much as I could, but I couldn't see anything. The sound was distant, but it was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I forced myself to stay still, praying that whoever it was wouldn't find me. I had no way of defending myself, and I knew if they saw me, there would be no way I could run. I had to focus on getting out of this trap, but I couldn't help but feel that someone was watching me. That they were getting closer. The minutes felt like hours. I kept hearing noises, footsteps, twigs breaking, but I couldn't see anyone. I knew whoever it was wasn't too far off. They had to know I was here. The feeling of being hunted, trapped like an animal, was overwhelming. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, each thump a reminder of how vulnerable I was. Finally, with a desperate move, I managed to use the knife to pry the trap open just enough to slide my foot out. The pain was blinding, but I didn't stop. I forced myself to stand, even though I could barely feel my leg. I didn't care. I stumbled forward, dragging myself away from the trap, my vision swimming from the pain. I had to get back to camp. I didn't care how, but I had to make it. I stumbled back to the path, trying to get back to camp. My ankle was bleeding, my whole body aching from the strain, but I couldn't stop. The thought that someone could be following me, watching me, made it impossible to slow down. Every step felt like a lifetime, but I kept going. Eventually, I made it back to camp, but the relief was short-lived. There was still the sick feeling that someone had been watching me, and I wasn't sure I was safe yet. I don't know who set the trap, or if they were still out there, but I didn't stay another night to find out. I packed up as quickly as I could, ignoring the pain in my leg, and drove straight back to the nearest town. It's been weeks, but I still feel like someone's watching me when I'm alone in the woods. I haven't gone back, and I don't think I ever will. It had been raining for hours by the time we decided to stop for the night. The forecast had said scattered showers, but it turned into a steady downpour that turned the dirt roads into slippery paths. Our plan was simple: drive out to the woods, set up camp, and get away from everything for a weekend. It was supposed to be a break from work, stress, all that. None of us thought to check if the spot we picked was public land. It just looked like a good place to pitch a tent, and it was getting dark fast. There were 4 of us: me, Jason, Claire, and Matt. We parked near a clearing by the trees. It wasn't an official campsite, but it looked secluded and quiet. We got the tents up quickly despite the rain. The sound of the drops hitting the canvas was loud but kind of calming. After that, we sat around under a tarp Jason had brought, trying to keep the fire going with damp wood. We laughed a bit, told some stories, but we were all soaked, so the fun didn't last long. By 11, we gave up and went to bed. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The rain had lightened up, just a faint tapping against the tent now. Everything was quiet except for that. I thought maybe I had heard an animal or something, but when I listened closer, I heard voices. Low, angry voices. I unzipped the sleeping bag carefully and leaned toward the tent door, straining to hear. Jason's tent was closest to mine, and I could hear him whispering to someone. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone wasn't good. He sounded scared. Then I heard another voice, deep and sharp, cutting through the rain. "You've got no right to be here," it said. I froze. I could tell it wasn't one of us, and it was angry. I peeked through the small mesh window on the tent and saw a flashlight beam swinging around outside. It landed on Jason's face for a second, and he winced. The light moved, and then I saw him, an older man, tall and broad, wearing a camo jacket and a white-brimmed hat. He was holding a rifle. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. The man pointed the rifle at the ground near Jason's feet and barked, "You think you can just walk onto someone's property and do whatever you like? Who gave you permission?" Jason stammered something about not knowing, about it being an accident. The man didn't seem to care. His voice got louder. An accident? You think that makes it okay? You've got 10 seconds to pack up and leave, or I'll make you leave. You hear me? I wanted to get up, to help Jason somehow, but I was terrified. I didn't know if the man would see me as a threat or if he'd just turn the gun on me too. I stayed crouched in the tent, gripping my phone, even though I had no signal out here. Claire must have heard it too, because I saw the light from her phone flashlight flicker on in her tent. That was a mistake. The man noticed it immediately. Who else is out here? He shouted, swinging the rifle toward her tent. He stomped toward it, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly as he moved. Come out. Now! Jason tried to say something, maybe to calm him down, but the man shoved him backward. Jason stumbled and fell, landing hard in the mud. Claire unzipped her tent slowly and stepped out with her hands up, shaking. Matt's tent was still zipped shut, no movement from inside. He was either frozen like me or still asleep somehow. The man's face was pale and lined, and his eyes were wild. He waved a rifle between Jason and Claire, spitting questions. How many of you are there? What are you doing here? You spying on me? Claire stammered something about just camping, just passing through. The man didn't seem to believe her. He kept muttering under his breath, things like, liars, and think you can sneak around my land. Then he looked at her tent, then Jason's, then mine. His eyes narrowed. There's more of you, isn't there? Come out, all of you. I didn't know what to do. If I stayed hidden, he might think we were trying to trick him, but if I came out, I didn't know what he'd do. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Finally, I unzipped the tent slowly, keeping my hands visible. I stepped out into the wet grass, my socks soaking through instantly. The man stared at me, his jaw tight. Another one, he said, almost to himself. He pointed the rifle toward the last tent, Matt's. What about him? Before I could answer, Matt's tent unzipped. He came out with his hands up like the rest of us, his face pale and scared. The man stared at all four of us, his flashlight flickering over each of our faces. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just breathed heavily. Then he spat on the ground and said, You've got 5 minutes. Pack up and get off my land. If I see you here again, I'll shoot first and ask questions later. None of us moved right away. He shouted, now, and that got us going. We scrambled to take down the tents, our hands fumbling with the wet fabric and slippery poles. The man stood there the whole time, his rifle resting on his hip, watching us with cold eyes. It took longer than 5 minutes, but he didn't stop us. He just kept muttering to himself, shaking his head like we'd done something personal to him. When we finally had everything packed, we started toward the car. Jason tried to apologize again, but the man cut him off. Just go, he said. And don't come back. We didn't need to be told twice. We piled into the car, and Jason started it up, the tires spinning a little in the mud before catching. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the man still standing there, his flashlight beam following us until we were out of sight. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main road, miles away. No one said much after that. We just sat there, soaked and shaken, the rain still pounding on the roof. We knew we'd been lucky. The man could have done a lot worse than yell at us. I still think about him sometimes, the way he looked at us, like we weren't people, just intruders. It makes me wonder what he was so afraid of or what he was hiding. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a small group of us heading out to the woods for some camping. We were a tight-knit group, 4 friends who had been hanging out together since college. The plan was to hike, set up camp, and just enjoy the quiet of the forest. No phones, no distractions, just us and nature. We had been hiking for a few hours, making our way along an unfamiliar trail we found on a map. The weather had been nice, the kind of cold breeze that makes the woods smell fresh. There wasn't much talk as we walked, just the sound of our boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional laugh about something stupid. We all agreed that this was the kind of trip we needed, peaceful and undisturbed. Then we came across the cabin. It wasn't marked on the trail map, which was odd. It wasn't even in good condition. The roof was sagging in some places, and there were a few windows that were boarded up, but there was no mistaking it, this place had been abandoned for a while. There was no road leading to it, no signs of people around, just trees and silence. At first, we all thought it was just an old hunting cabin or maybe some kind of relic from years ago. It wasn't uncommon to find these kinds of things when you ventured into the woods. But then, we noticed something strange. There was a new, fresh-looking trail of footprints leading up to the porch. It wasn't a large set, just a single pair of boots, maybe a man's, making their way in and out of the cabin. I don't know why, but none of us decided to turn around right then. Instead, we stood there for a few moments, looking at each other. It was like we all had the same idea, that we should check it out. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was because we were tired and the cabin looked like a perfect place to rest for a while. Whatever it was, we moved closer. As we approached, the creaky wooden steps groaned beneath our weight, and one of the boards nearly snapped. The air around the cabin felt colder, but it wasn't the kind of cold that comes from a shift in temperature. It was more of an uncomfortable chill that seemed to seep into your bones. We joked about it at first, saying it was just the old cabin giving off strange vibes, but there was something about it that felt wrong. We knocked on the door, half expecting no one to answer. But when no one responded, we opened it slowly, half expecting the hinges to squeak, but it didn't. It was a soft, almost deliberate creak. The inside was dark, dust settling on the furniture and wooden floors. The place looked abandoned for sure, but there was something that didn't sit right. There was an odd smell, a mix of stale air and something earthy, like wet dirt. The furniture was sparse, an old couch covered in a gray sheet, a coffee table with some old magazines, a chair near the window that looked out toward the trees. It was empty, except for one detail, a backpack sitting on the floor, near the door. It was open, as though someone had just been there and left in a hurry. We all stood there for a while, not really knowing what to say. I could feel my heart beating in my chest, but I didn't want to be the first to admit that something felt off. Then one of my friends, Chris, picked up the backpack. He opened it, rummaging through the contents. "Hey, check this out," he said. We all crowded around. Inside the bag, there were a few sets of clothes, a flashlight, a couple of water bottles, and what looked like a few empty cans of food. But there was something else, something that made my stomach drop. Tucked in between the cans was a thick rope, and next to that, a half-empty bottle of something that smelled like alcohol. Chris pulled his hand back quickly, and for the first time, we all looked at each other with a shared realization this wasn't just an abandoned cabin. Someone had been living here, recently. It was all too recent. "I think we should leave," Sarah said quietly, her voice shaking. She was usually the most adventurous of us, always the one encouraging us to take risks. But now, even she looked unnerved. We didn't argue. We quickly made our way back to the door, but when we got to the porch, we heard something, a faint sound from the woods behind the cabin. A snap of a twig, followed by a slow, steady footstep. We froze. I didn't even have to look at the others to know they were thinking the same thing. Someone was out there. and they knew we were here. Let's go. Now, I said, my voice a little too sharp. We turned to leave, but then the door to the cabin slammed shut behind us, like it had been pushed by an invisible hand. Everyone jumped. We ran down the stairs, and as we rounded the corner of the cabin, we saw a figure standing in the woods, just out of reach of the trees. It was too dark to make out his face, but his figure was unmistakable, tall, with a dark jacket and what looked like a pair of boots. I don't know who moved first, whether it was me or one of the others, but we didn't waste a second. We ran in the opposite direction, towards the trees, not even looking back to see if he was following. We didn't need to. The sounds of the footsteps behind us were enough to make us push harder, faster. We didn't stop until we reached the trail again, and even then, we kept running. We didn't speak to each other at first, just breathing heavily, but eventually, when we stopped to catch our breath, we realized how close we had been to something terrible. We made it back to the car without further incident. As we drove away, none of us said much. I think we were all too shaken, too scared to speak about what had just happened. The cabin, the backpack, the figure in the woods, it didn't make sense. But we all knew one thing: someone had been living there, and they weren't far away. I don't know who they were, or what they intended to do, but I'll never forget the look in the man's eyes, the same kind of coldness that made my blood run cold. I'm just thankful we made it out alive. And I'll never go camping again without wondering if someone's watching me from the woods. It happened during a layover. I had a few hours to kill before my next flight, so I was just hanging around the airport, trying to pass the time. I'd been traveling for what felt like forever, and my head was starting to ache from the combination of exhaustion and the constant noise of the terminal. I wasn't in the best mood, but it wasn't a big deal. I figured I'd just sit and wait for my boarding time. I found an empty seat by one of the gates, just far enough from the crowd so I could have a little peace. I pulled out my phone, started scrolling through emails and news, trying to distract myself. About an hour passed like that, nothing eventful. I didn't even notice the man sitting down next to me at first. He seemed normal enough. He smiled and said, "Looks like you've got a while to wait." I nodded. Yeah, just killing time. I didn't expect much from the conversation, but I wasn't in a rush to be rude either. He introduced himself as Tim. He was wearing a business suit, probably in his late 30s, with short, neatly combed hair. He seemed friendly, nothing off about him. He was just another traveler, like me. He told me he had just come back from a business trip and was waiting for his connecting flight. We chatted a little about where we were both headed, and I assumed it was just small talk to pass the time. Then, after a few minutes, he asked if I'd ever been to the city we were both flying into. I told him I hadn't, but that I was excited to check it out. That's when he leaned in a bit, lowered his voice, and said something that caught me off guard. "You know, if you need help with directions, I've got some great local tips. I've been to that city a few times, and I know a guy who can really help you out. He's the best driver in town, doesn't charge too much, and he can show you all the best spots. It's nice to have someone who knows the area, especially when you're traveling alone." I thought it was a bit strange, but it wasn't like I hadn't heard similar things before. People in airports were always offering advice, and I didn't think much of it. I thanked him and said I'd probably just take a taxi from the airport. But Tim wouldn't let it go. He kept talking about how much easier it would be to get around if I used his guy, how much cheaper it would be than a regular taxi, and how much more reliable the service was. He even said that if I didn't mind waiting a bit, he'd make a call for me and set it up. I was starting to feel a little uncomfortable. I wasn't sure why, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. The way he kept insisting, the fact that he was almost too eager. But I figured I was just overthinking it. I'd been traveling for hours. My mind was foggy. "All right," I said. "Maybe I'll take you up on that. But I'll let you know if I change my mind." Tim smiled, and that's when things started to shift in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't a bad smile, exactly, but it was too smooth, too practiced. "No problem," he said. "I'll just go make the call and we'll get you all set up. It'll be easier for you, trust me." I watched as he stood up and walked toward the back of the terminal, dialing something on his phone. I didn't think much of it, still half distracted by my own thoughts. A few minutes later, he returned, looking pleased. "It's all set," he said. "The driver will meet you right by the exit. He's expecting you, so you won't have to wait around." I felt a twinge of doubt but told myself it was fine. It was just a ride. I was being paranoid. Tim seemed nice enough. I thanked him, and he said it was no trouble, just doing a favor for a fellow traveler. I followed him to the exit of the airport, where I saw a man standing by a car. He was wearing dark sunglasses, even though it was still light outside, and he was holding a sign with my name on it. It all seemed so normal, so official, that I almost didn't question it. But something nagged at me. Tim stood there, watching me, his hands in his pockets, like he was waiting for something. "There he is," Tim said, his voice too calm. "You'll be in good hands." I hesitated for a moment, but the man with the sign smiled at me and waved. I walked up to him, told him my name, and he nodded. "Right this way," he said, opening the back door of the car. I was about to climb in when I noticed something odd. There was a faint smell inside the car, something like stale air mixed with cleaning chemicals. And the car wasn't a typical taxi, it looked more like a private vehicle, older, and there were no obvious markings. That's when I heard Tim's voice behind me, still too calm, still a little too eager. "Don't worry," he said. "This is the best way to go. You'll get there much faster, and you won't have to deal with the hassle of the airport." I froze. Something clicked. A thought flashed through my mind. This wasn't right. There was no reason for him to be so invested in my ride. There was no reason for him to be pushing this so hard. I quickly turned around and walked away from the car. The man with the sign started to follow me, and that's when I realized how wrong everything felt. Tim stayed by the door of the car, his eyes watching me intently. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to get away. I ran back inside the terminal, looking around for security, for someone who might help. The man with the sign didn't follow me, but Tim did. He was walking toward me, his expression hardening, no longer friendly. I made my way to the nearest gate, where a security guard was standing. I went up to him, explained everything as best I could, and showed him the man's picture on my phone. He looked at me like I was crazy, but when I pointed out that the situation didn't feel right, he called for backup. Turns out, the whole thing was a scam. Tim wasn't a fellow traveler, and the driver wasn't really a driver. They were part of a group that targeted people with long layovers, offering them rides that were just a setup for robbery or worse. They had a whole operation going, luring unsuspecting people with offers of cheap, convenient transportation. I never found out how far they would have gone if I'd gotten in that car, but I'm sure it wouldn't have ended well. I'm just glad I walked away in time. The rest of my layover was spent in a corner of the terminal, surrounded by security. When I finally boarded my flight, I could still feel the tension in my chest, the creeping feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something much worse. I won't be trusting strangers in airports again. Not ever. I had been job hunting for months when I got an email about an interview. It was for a position I'd applied to a few weeks earlier, some kind of administrative role. The email came from someone named Daniel Rowe, the hiring manager. The company, Bridgepoint Solutions, seemed legit. They had a basic website, nothing fancy, just enough to show they existed. The interview was set for 5 p.m. on a Friday. I remember thinking it was a weird time, but I didn't question it. The address was in the industrial area on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't far, maybe a 20-minute drive from my apartment. When I got there, it was already getting dark. The building was a large, gray structure, the kind of place you'd expect to see offices for logistics or manufacturing companies. The parking lot was almost empty except for a few cars scattered around. That felt strange, but I told myself it was because it was late on a Friday. I parked and walked to the front door. It looked clean and well kept, with a small plaque that read Bridgepoint Solutions. I pressed the buzzer, and a voice came through the speaker. "Come in." "Second floor," the man said. The door clicked, unlocking, and I stepped inside. The lobby was quiet. Too quiet. There was no receptionist, just an empty desk with a stack of outdated magazines. The air felt still, like no one had been there in a while. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe they were cutting costs or working remotely. I took the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was dimly lit, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. There were several doors, all closed. At the end of the hall was one door slightly ajar with a light on inside. A small sign next to it read Conference Room B. I knocked. "Come in," the same voice said. I stepped inside, and a man stood up from the table. He looked ordinary, dark hair, a button-up shirt, probably mid-40s. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be Emily," he said, holding out his hand. "Yes," I said, shaking it. His grip was firm, too firm, and his hand was cold. Something about him put me on edge, but I couldn't pinpoint what. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like he was studying me. "Have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair across the table. The room was sparse. Just a table, a few chairs, and a whiteboard with nothing written on it. No laptops, no paperwork, no sign of any actual business. I sat down, my stomach twisting. "So, tell me about yourself," he said, leaning forward. I started talking about my work experience, but he barely listened. His eyes were locked on mine the entire time, unblinking. He didn't take notes, didn't ask follow-up questions. When I paused, he just smiled again, that same empty smile. "Interesting," he said after a moment. "You seem very qualified." "Thank you," I said, forcing a smile. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, like he was sizing me up. The silence stretched on too long. "Do you live nearby?" he asked suddenly. That question threw me. It had nothing to do with the job. About 20 minutes away," I said cautiously. He nodded, as if that was important information. "Do you live alone?" Now I was alarmed. That had nothing to do with the interview. I laughed nervously. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious," he said, sitting back in his chair. His tone was casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching my every move. I decided I'd had enough. "I don't think this is relevant to the position," I said, standing up. "Thank you for your time." "Sit down," he said, his voice low and firm. I froze. There was no friendliness in his tone anymore. He stood up, blocking the door. My heart started pounding. I tried to keep my voice steady. "I think we're done here," I said, stepping toward the door. "You're not going anywhere," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a knife, the blade catching the light. My blood ran cold. "Don't scream," he said. "If you do, I'll make this worse for you." I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The room was small, and he was between me and the door. "Please," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I won't tell anyone. Just let me go." He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, the knife glinting in his hand. I backed up until I hit the wall, my breathing quick and shallow. Then I remembered my phone. It was in my bag, slung over the back of the chair. He hadn't taken it. If I could just distract him for a moment. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, trying to keep him talking. He smiled again, that same empty smile. "Because I can," he said simply. While he spoke, I inched toward the chair, my fingers brushing the strap of my bag. I grabbed it and yanked it toward me, pretending to stumble. The movement startled him, and he lunged at me. I screamed and swung the bag at him with all my strength. It hit his arm, knocking the knife to the floor. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the chair and slammed it into his chest, sending him stumbling back. I ran for the door, yanking it open and bolting down the hallway. He was right behind me, his footsteps pounding against the floor. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. I reached the stairs and practically threw myself down them, skipping steps, nearly falling. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. When I reached the lobby, I ran straight for the door, fumbling with the lock. He was halfway down the stairs when I finally got it open. I sprinted to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors just as he burst out of the building. He pounded on the driver's side window, yelling something I couldn't hear over my own panic breathing. I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, not stopping until I was miles away. When I finally pulled over, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The police didn't find him. When they searched the building, it was empty, and the knife was gone. The company? It didn't exist. The website was a fake, probably set up just to lure people like me. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out of there, but I don't want to think about it. It was late, and the rain hadn't stopped all day. I was at the library trying to finish an essay that was already overdue, my laptop battery at 3%, and I still had no idea how to end the last paragraph. The lights flickered once, and I knew I couldn't push it any longer. When I packed up my things, the library was nearly empty. The rain outside had gotten heavier, the kind that turned streets into rivers. I sighed, looking at the umbrellas in the stand near the door. Mine was gone, someone must have taken it by mistake, but I wasn't going to walk home in this weather without one. I grabbed a plain black umbrella that looked just like mine and stepped outside. The walk to my apartment wasn't far, just 10 minutes if I cut through the small park on the edge of campus. The rain made the whole world quieter. There was nothing but the sound of water hitting the pavement and the occasional car hissing by. The streets were empty, and most of the streetlights were reflected in puddles. I kept my head down and tried not to think about how cold it was. I noticed the man when I turned onto the path through the park. He was standing by one of the benches, his head tilted up, like he was looking at the rain. He had no umbrella or hood, just a dark jacket that clung to his shoulders. At first, I thought he was just someone who liked the rain, maybe taking a break from wherever he was going. But as I passed him, He turned and started walking in the same direction. I didn't think much of it. It was a public path, after all, and it wasn't unusual to see other students cutting through here. Still, something about the way his footsteps matched mine made me uneasy. I glanced back, and he was closer than I thought, his face hard to make out in the dim light. "Hey," he called, his voice sharp and clear over the rain. "That's my umbrella." I stopped, gripping the handle tighter. "What?" He took a few steps closer, his face coming into the light. He was older than me, maybe mid-30s, with wet hair plastered to his forehead and dark eyes that didn't seem to blink. "You took my umbrella," he said, his tone flat. I looked at the umbrella in my hand. It was just a plain black one, nothing special. "This was in the stand," I said. "I thought it was mine." "If it's yours, I'm sorry." "Here." I held it out to him, but he didn't take it. Instead, he just stared at me, water dripping from his face. "You took it," he repeated, like I hadn't just offered it back. I felt my stomach tighten. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about the umbrella. "Look, I'm sorry," I said again, a little more firmly. "Take it." He still didn't move. I didn't know what else to do, so I set the umbrella on the ground and started walking again. The rain was colder now, soaking through my clothes, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get home. His footsteps started again behind me. "Hey," he called again, louder this time. "Wait." I ignored him, picking up my pace. My apartment building wasn't far now, just at the edge of the park. I could see the lights in the windows, warm and inviting. I was almost there when I heard his footsteps break into a run. Panic hit me like a wave, and I started running too, the water splashing around my ankles. My bag banged against my hip, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear him getting closer, his breaths loud and uneven. I reached the door of my building and fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. I glanced over my shoulder, and he was there, just a few feet away, his face pale and twisted with something I couldn't name. "Give it back," he shouted, his voice raw. "I left it on the path." I shouted back, my voice breaking. "It's right there." He didn't seem to hear me. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm. His grip was like iron, his fingers digging into my skin. I screamed, twisting away, and the movement sent me crashing into the door. My keys slipped from my fingers and fell into the puddle at my feet. "Let go!" I yelled, my voice cracking. He didn't say anything this time, just pulled harder, dragging me away from the door. His strength was terrifying. I kicked out, my foot connecting with his shin, and he stumbled just enough for me to wrench free. I grabbed my keys and jammed them into the lock, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door. The small window at the top was fogged with rain, but I could see him standing there, his hands pressed against the glass, his face twisted in anger. "You took it," he said again, his voice muffled but still clear. "You don't get to keep it." I didn't know what he meant. It was just an umbrella. A stupid, cheap umbrella. He stayed there for a long moment, his hands sliding down the glass, leaving streaks of water. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. I didn't sleep that night. I kept expecting to hear him pounding on the door or see his face at the window. The next morning, when the rain finally stopped, I went back to the park. The umbrella was gone. I'll start by saying that I never wanted to be in that basement. Ever. I never asked to be there. But that night, everything changed. It had been raining heavily for days, and the forecast predicted another storm. I had just moved into the house, a quiet, somewhat secluded place on the edge of town. The house was old, but I loved it. It was the kind of place you could picture yourself growing old in, with a big front porch and an overgrown garden in the back. It had character, sure, but it was perfect for me. At least, that's what I thought. It wasn't long before I noticed the flooding. I started to hear strange sounds from the basement, but I ignored them at first. Old houses make noise, right? The first time I went down there, I was just going to check on some boxes I had shoved to the back. When I opened the door, the damp smell hit me. Not unusual, I thought. It had been rainy, and the basement was always a little musty. The next morning, I went down again to grab a few things, and that's when I saw the water. It was only a couple inches deep, but enough to make me uneasy. The storm wasn't supposed to hit until later, but it seemed like the house had taken on more water than I realized. I went back upstairs to grab towels and a mop, trying to get ahead of it before it became too much. By the time I returned, the water had risen even higher. Panic set in, but I kept calm. I started moving the boxes, books, and some of the furniture that had been left in the basement when I moved in. There were some family heirlooms I didn't want to lose. The water was getting colder, creeping into the edges of the room. It was clear the basement had some drainage issues, but it was too late now to worry about that. I was kneeling, shifting one of the boxes, when I noticed something odd. A section of the wall near the back of the basement was different. The wood looked slightly darker, almost like it had been exposed to water more than the rest of the walls. There was a small gap at the bottom, barely noticeable, but it was enough to make me curious. I stood up and moved toward it, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The water lapped at my boots as I knelt down to inspect it. My fingers brushed the edge of the wall. It was strange, cold to the touch, and slightly damp. I pushed against it with more force than I meant to, and the panel shifted. I froze. Behind the panel, there was a small space. I wasn't sure if it was a mistake or something intentional, but it looked like the wall had been covering a hidden door, one I hadn't noticed when I moved in. My breath caught in my throat, and I suddenly didn't know if I wanted to open it. But I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed the edge of the panel, pulled it out, and revealed the dark opening behind it. The air felt colder, and the basement seemed to get quieter somehow. The rain outside was still coming down hard, but it almost sounded muffled in comparison to the silence in the basement. I found a small wooden door, old and warped. There was no handle, but there were markings on the wood, deep gouges, almost like something had scraped along the surface for a long time. I hesitated, staring at the door. Something about it felt off, but I pushed past the feeling and grabbed the edge, pulling it open. It creaked loudly as it moved, and my stomach dropped. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. The air in there was musty, stale, and so cold it made my skin crawl. I didn't want to go inside, but I couldn't look away. There was something about it that pulled me in, like it was waiting for me. I stepped inside. The room was tiny, barely big enough for a few people to stand in. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, just some old, rotting furniture and dust everywhere. But then I saw them items scattered around the floor. Old, strange objects that didn't belong there. I didn't know what to make of it at first. Some of it looked like trash, old papers, broken glass, but there were others, things that I couldn't explain. There was a chair in the corner, stained with something that wasn't just dirt. My heart raced as I looked closer at the items. On the floor next to the chair, there was a small, old-fashioned mirror. It was cracked, but there was something about it that made me feel uneasy, like it was watching me. My mind was starting to race, trying to make sense of everything. I stepped back, my body trembling. Something told me to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. In the middle of the room, there was a small, worn wooden box. I approached it slowly, not sure if I really wanted to open it, but I did. Inside, there were more things, more disturbing items, a handful of dried flowers, a faded photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, and something wrapped in an old, dirty cloth. I unwrapped the cloth, and that's when I found it. A small, rusted key. It was so old that it looked like it shouldn't even exist anymore. My hand shook as I held it. But the more I stared at it, the more I realized that this was no random collection of forgotten belongings. It was deliberate. Someone had placed everything here, and it was meant for someone, maybe me, to find. I stood there, still holding the key, the dark room pressing in around me. My instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't stop staring at the key. And then, just as I was about to step back, I heard it. A noise. From upstairs. A door creaked, followed by footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was in the house. Someone who shouldn't have been. I couldn't breathe. I dropped the key, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned and bolted toward the door. But as I reached it, I glanced over my shoulder. I couldn't stop myself. The chair in the corner was different. Someone had moved it. It wasn't where I had left it. I didn't wait. I ran back upstairs, my pulse thundering in my ears. I didn't even bother to check the water in the basement. The flooding, the room, the key, it all seemed too real, too horrifying to comprehend. I got out of the house that night. I called a friend to pick me up and never went back. The place was left behind, and I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I still wonder who lived there before me, and what they were hiding. And, more than anything, I wonder if they're still watching from that dark room. It was one of those nights where the rain never really stops. The kind of storm that makes the streets look like rivers, and the wind howls loud enough to drown out everything else. I had been walking home from my shift at work, soaked through despite the umbrella, and I was so ready to be inside, away from the weather. I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare, not bothering to check which car it was. I just wanted to get home. I watched the little map on my phone, waiting for the car to pull up. I wasn't far from the usual spot where I'd get picked up, and I saw the pin slowly move closer, the car approaching. As it got near, I stepped to the curb and looked up. A black sedan was coming down the road, slowing down. I stepped forward, glad the wait was almost over. When the car stopped in front of me, the window rolled down, and the driver looked out. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with dark hair and a beard. His face was tired, like he hadn't slept in a while. I didn't think much of it. I got in the back seat, thanked him, and told him where I was headed. I just wanted to get home, have some tea, and relax. The last thing on my mind was that something was wrong. The driver didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, and then he started driving. The route on my app didn't seem right, though. We weren't heading in the direction I expected. I had been in this part of town enough to know the main roads, and I could tell we were heading south when I should have been going north. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you're going the wrong way." He didn't say anything at first. Just kept driving. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, or maybe he was new to the area. I tried again. "I need to go to Maple Street, not South Boulevard. You've missed the turn. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, and I caught the briefest glimpse of something strange in his eyes. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was something else. Something colder. But then he spoke. "It's a shortcut," he said, his voice flat, like he was explaining something simple. "Don't worry. You'll get there." I didn't believe him. I checked my phone again. The little pin on the map was still moving in the wrong direction. We weren't heading toward Maple Street. The more I stared at the screen, the more I realized we were going farther away from where I needed to be. "Are you sure about this?" I said, trying to keep the fear from my voice. "I really need to go that way." I pointed to the north, trying to be calm, but I felt a rising sense of panic. The driver didn't reply. Instead, he just turned the corner and accelerated. The streets were empty, and the rain continued to fall, hammering against the car's roof. I tried not to think too much about the fact that we were now on streets I didn't recognize. "Hey, can you stop the car?" I asked, my heart starting to beat faster. "I need to get out." He still didn't respond. He didn't even glance at me in the mirror this time. I began to feel the weight of the silence in the car. It felt oppressive, like the air itself was thickening. I could hear the sound of the rain hitting the windshield and the hum of the engine, but it all felt distant. I was alone in this car with him, and it was getting harder to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. I wasn't sure what was happening. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This felt deliberate. I needed to get out. I needed to get home. "Stop the car," I demanded, louder this time, my voice trembling. "I'm not going any farther with you. Stop the car, now." Finally, he glanced at me in the mirror. He didn't smile. He didn't look worried. He just looked tired. As if he had been waiting for me to say something for a long time. "You're going to be fine," he said, his voice low and calm, like he was trying to reassure me. But I could hear something in it that made my skin crawl. It wasn't reassuring. It was cold. And it didn't sound like he was trying to comfort me. It sounded like a command. "I'm serious," I said, my voice shaking. "Pull over. Let me out." But he didn't. The car kept moving. The streets around us were getting more desolate. The houses were spaced farther apart, and I couldn't even see streetlights now, just the dim glow of his headlights cutting through the rain-soaked night. My mind was racing. I reached for my phone again, hands shaking, and I tried to send a message to a friend. My hands were so wet that I could barely type, but I managed to send the message. "Something's wrong. The driver is going the wrong way. Please call the cops if I don't respond." It felt like forever before I saw him glance in the mirror again. This time, his eyes lingered longer, and I knew without a doubt that something was wrong. He wasn't taking me to my destination. He was taking me somewhere else. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but my voice betrayed me, breaking as I spoke. "Relax," he said again, his voice like a slow drawl. "You're going to be fine. We're almost there." I had no idea where there was, but I wasn't about to find out. I shoved my phone back into my pocket and tried the door. It was locked. I tried to press the button to open the door from the inside, but it didn't work. He had locked it. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around the car, desperate for something, anything to help. I had to get out. I reached for the handle again, this time pulling with everything I had. The door clicked, and I didn't hesitate. I opened the door, yanked it wide, and as the car slowed for a turn, I threw myself out of it. I hit the wet pavement hard, my knees scraping against the ground as I scrambled to my feet. The car didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. I didn't look back. I just ran. My shoes were soaked, my legs screaming, but I didn't care. I ran and ran, not stopping until I found a house with lights on. I knocked frantically, and someone finally answered. A woman in her pajamas, clearly startled. I couldn't even explain myself properly. I was so shaken. But she took one look at me and called the police. The cops came. I don't know what they did with the driver, but I know I never saw him again. They didn't find him that night, not in the places I thought he might have gone. They said it was likely he just picked someone up for whatever reason and got scared when I tried to leave. Maybe he was trying to get away with something. I don't know. The ride was supposed to be the end of my shift, the end of a tiring night. But it turned into something else. Something I won't forget. That driver, he wasn't just lost. He knew exactly where he was going. And I'm just glad I got out when I did. I don't take ride sharing anymore. Not after that night. We had set up camp late that afternoon, just before the sun started to dip below the ridge. It was me, my brother Will, and two of our friends, Jake and Brian. We picked a spot near a small lake at the edge of the forest, a place we camped at before. It was quiet, peaceful. We liked it because it felt far from everything, even though the trailhead wasn't more than a 2-hour hike away. We spent the evening like we always did, joking around, cooking dinner over the fire, and talking about nothing in particular. It was cool but not too cold, and the sky was clear. You could see every star. After we ate, Brian pulled out a flask, and we passed it around while the fire crackled. It wasn't until sometime after 10 that Jake noticed the other fire. "Hey," he said, his voice low, like he didn't want to draw too much attention. "Was that there before?" We all looked where he was pointing. Across the lake, maybe 300 yards away, a faint orange glow flickered through the trees. It was definitely a fire. "No way," Will said. "I didn't see it earlier." "Me neither," I said. I think I would have noticed. It was strange. The lake wasn't huge, but it was big enough that we'd have seen someone setting up camp on the other side. And it wasn't like it was a popular spot. In all the times we'd been there, we'd never run into anyone else. "Maybe someone showed up after dark," Brian said, though he didn't sound convinced. We sat there, staring at the fire. It didn't seem to be moving, like whoever had made it was just sitting there, not doing much of anything. "You think we should go check it out?" Jake asked. "What, now?" Will said. "It's late. Let's just leave it. Whoever it is, they're not bothering us." That made sense, but it still didn't sit right with me. Something about it felt off. Maybe it was the fact that we hadn't seen or heard anyone all day, or maybe it was just the way the fire seemed so still. We tried to go back to our conversation, but the mood had shifted. Every few minutes, one of us would glance across the lake, like we were expecting something to happen. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. The fire across the lake was still burning as we put out our own and headed to our tents. I lay there in the dark for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest and wondering who was out there. The next morning, I woke up early, just as the sun was rising. I crawled out of my tent and stretched, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. The others were still asleep, so I walked down to the lake to wash up. That's when I saw it. The fire across the lake was gone. Not just out, completely gone. There wasn't even any smoke rising from the spot where it had been. I stared at the empty shoreline, my stomach sinking. "Hey!" I called back toward camp. "You guys need to see this." A few minutes later, they were all standing next to me, looking across the lake. "That's weird," Jake said. "It was definitely there last night, right?" We all agreed. There was no way we'd imagined it. "Maybe they packed up and left early," Brian suggested, though he didn't sound too sure. "I want to see where it was," I said. "Come on." We grabbed our stuff and walked around the edge of the lake. It took about 20 minutes to reach the spot where we'd seen the fire. As we got closer, I felt a growing sense of unease. When we reached it, my unease turned to dread. There was no sign of a campsite. No fire ring, no ashes, no footprints, nothing. The ground was damp from the morning dew, and it didn't look like anyone had been there at all. "What the hell?" Will said, his voice shaky. "Maybe we got the spot wrong," Brian said, but he didn't sound convinced. "This was it," I said. "I'm sure of it." We stood there for a while, looking around, but there was nothing to find. Eventually, we gave up and headed back to our camp. When we got there, we stopped dead in our tracks. Our campsite was wrecked. Our tents were still there, but everything else, our backpacks, our cooking gear, even our boots, had been moved. It was all arranged in a circle around a small, burned-out fire pit that hadn't been there the night before. None of us spoke for a long time. We just stood there, staring at the mess. "Who the hell did this?" Jake finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked around, my heart pounding. The woods felt too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. "We need to get out of here," Will said. We scrambled to gather our things. Some of our stuff was wet from the dew, but we didn't care. We just wanted to leave. As we packed up, I kept glancing at the trees, expecting to see someone watching us. We hiked back to the trailhead as fast as we could, not stopping to rest. The whole way, I felt like we were being followed, though I never saw or heard anything. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the words scratched into the driver's side door. "Keep out." We didn't stick around to think about it. We just got in and drove. I don't know who was out there with us, or why they did what they did. All I know is that I'm never going back to that lake. We had been camping for 2 days when it all started. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a group of friends looking to disconnect from our busy lives and spend some time in nature. No cell service, no distractions, just us in the woods. It was peaceful at first, just what we needed. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call or the rustling of the wind in the trees. We set up camp near a small creek, and everything was fine for the first day. We brought a portable radio with us to pass the time in the evenings. It was a cheap one, not anything fancy, just one of those small battery-operated models that could pick up the basic AM/FM stations. On the second night, after dinner and a few drinks, we sat around the fire and turned it on to see what we could pick up. There was nothing much on the regular stations, just static, so we started turning the dial randomly to see if we could find something more interesting. At first, it didn't seem like anything was out of the ordinary. We laughed, joked, and tried to make sense of the strange sounds we were hearing. The static would cut in and out, and we'd get fragments of voices now and then, but it was so garbled we could barely understand anything. We figured it was just bad reception, or maybe the batteries were starting to die. It wasn't until we started hearing clearer words that we began to get uneasy. It started with just a few short phrases. I remember one of the first ones, "They know where you are." It was barely audible at first, almost like a whisper lost in the static. At first, we thought it was just interference, something harmless. But the longer we listened, the more the voices began to come through. They were more distinct now, more deliberate. "Don't trust them. Stay inside tonight." It was the kind of thing that made you freeze for a moment. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to make of it. Was it a prank? Maybe some weird channel or station that was messing with us. But the voices, they didn't sound like radio hosts or anything normal. They sounded wrong. Like someone was trying to get a message through, but something was off. At first, we dismissed it. We laughed it off, tried to brush it away. We turned the dial again, and the voices stopped. We found another station, and the rest of the night went by quietly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing the words in my head, "Stay inside tonight." The next day, we went hiking during the day. It was a beautiful trail, and we enjoyed it, trying to forget about the strange occurrence from the night before. But when we got back to camp, the radio was still there, sitting on the log next to the fire pit. It was hard not to think about what happened, especially since the feeling in the air had changed. The wind had picked up, and the forest felt denser, like it was closing in on us. We didn't talk much about the radio. No one wanted to bring it up, but I think we were all thinking about it. It wasn't until nightfall that things really started to get strange. We sat down by the fire again, and one of us, Chris, I think, decided to mess with the radio again. This time, it wasn't just a few words. We picked up a full sentence, and it wasn't just static anymore. It was a voice, clear as day, like someone was right there with us. "Get out of the woods." We froze. It wasn't one of us, it wasn't a joke. It was a deep, raspy voice, almost threatening. The kind of voice that made your blood run cold. We all turned to look at each other, confused, but none of us said anything. Chris quickly turned the dial to another station, and for a few minutes, the radio was silent again. But it didn't stay that way. The static returned, but this time the words were louder, clearer, more urgent. "They know you're here. They're watching." That's when it really hit me. My heart started to pound. This wasn't a coincidence. There was no way it could be. Someone was sending these messages. But who? And why? We tried turning the radio off, but as soon as we turned it back on, the same voice came through. "Don't trust them. They're coming for you." At that point, I think we all realized something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just a weird coincidence anymore. I don't know what it was, but something was out there, and it knew we were here. The voices weren't random, they were directed at us. We didn't know what to do. We debated packing up and leaving, but it was getting late, and none of us wanted to make the hike back in the dark. We tried to stay calm, but every time we heard those messages, it felt like the forest was closing in on us. The firelight flickered, and the shadows around us seemed to grow longer, stretching toward us. The worst part was when the messages started to get more specific. "You're not alone. Come out. We know you're hiding." That last one hit me the hardest. We weren't hiding. We were sitting there, by the fire, in plain sight. But the voice made it sound like we were being watched, like someone was waiting for us to make a move. I don't know how much time passed after that. We were all on edge, jumping at every sound, every movement in the trees. No one spoke for a long time. We just sat there, staring at the fire, listening to the radio crackling in the background. Then, around midnight, it happened. The message came through again, only this time it wasn't a warning. It was a command. Leave the camp. Now. I don't think any of us hesitated. We grabbed our things, packed up as quickly as we could, and started to head out. I don't know what we thought we were running from, but we couldn't stay there anymore. It felt like we were being hunted. We made it back to the parking lot and into our cars. No one said a word. We just got in, started the engines, and left. As we drove away, the radio continued to crackle behind us, but we didn't dare turn it back on. We never went back to that spot. We couldn't. The feeling of being watched, the messages, the way the forest felt like it was closing in on us, it was too much. To this day, I don't know who was sending those messages. I don't know what they wanted or why they were following us. But I do know that something was out there in those woods, something that wanted us to leave. And I'm not ever going back to find out who or what it was. It happened a few months ago, but I still can't shake the feeling of what happened that night. I've told a few people about it, but I don't think anyone really gets how scary it was. I still don't fully understand how I ended up in that situation. It all started when I finished my work late one evening. I'm in marketing, and sometimes I'm stuck in the office for hours after everyone else leaves. It was around 11 p.m., and I just wanted to get home. Normally, I take the subway, but it was a Friday, and the trains always feel a little sketchy that late, so I decided to order a rideshare instead. I opened the app, booked a ride, and went outside to wait. I stood by the curb, scrolling through my phone, not really paying much attention to what was going on around me. I was tired and ready to get home. A few minutes later, I saw the car pull up. The app said the name and the car model, so I walked over to it and opened the door without thinking much about it. The driver, a man, looked a little older than me, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. He didn't seem unusual. He smiled at me when I got in, which I returned with a tired nod. He didn't say anything at first, so I just buckled my seatbelt and settled in, expecting to hear the usual small talk. But instead, he started driving without asking for confirmation or anything. It wasn't until we had driven for a few minutes that I noticed something was off. The route didn't feel familiar. I live in a part of the city that's pretty straightforward to get to from downtown, but we seemed to be heading in the opposite direction. I thought maybe he was taking an alternate route or something, but the streets were getting emptier and less familiar. At first, I didn't say anything. I figured maybe I had just misjudged the route in my tired state. But after about 10 minutes of driving down roads I didn't recognize, I started to get anxious. "Excuse me," I said, my voice a little shaky. "This isn't the way to my place." The driver didn't respond at first, just kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes on the road. I tried again. "Hey, I think you missed my turn. Can you turn around?" That's when he finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "No, we're going the right way." I could hear a slight accent in his voice, but it was hard to place. His eyes stayed locked on the road. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he wasn't paying attention. Still, something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. "Listen, I'm not sure where we're going, but I need to get home," I said, trying to keep my tone polite but firm. "Could you please turn around?" He glanced at me quickly, just a quick flick of his eyes, before looking back at the road. "You don't need to worry about it. I'll take care of it." I couldn't make sense of what was happening. At this point, I started to feel a little panicked. My phone was on the passenger seat beside me, and I considered texting a friend or calling someone. But something in my gut told me not to. I didn't want to give him any reason to get more defensive or angry. We kept driving for what felt like an eternity, passing familiar streetlights that grew more sparse the farther we went. The streets turned darker, and the buildings started to look less like the city and more like empty industrial areas. Where are we going? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. This is getting too far out. I need to go home. The driver didn't answer right away. The silence felt suffocating. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, but then he said something so quiet, I almost didn't catch it. You'll be fine. Just relax. That's when I started to really panic. The rational part of me wanted to get out, but I didn't know where we were, and I had no idea if I'd even be able to get another ride back. There was nothing around us but dark roads. I tried the door handle, but it was locked. I pulled harder, but it wouldn't budge. Please let me out, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though my heart was racing. I need to get out of the car now. The driver's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't look at me, but I could tell he was aware of what I had said. He didn't speak for a long time, and I started to feel like I was suffocating in the small space. Don't make this difficult, he finally said, his voice colder now. It was like a switch had flipped. You'll get out when I say so. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't happening. I was in a car with a stranger, headed somewhere I didn't know, with no way to get out. The panic hit me hard, and I started to think about what my options were. I could try to jump out when we stopped, but what if we were somewhere with no one around? What if he came after me? I wasn't strong enough to fight him off. The car slowed down, and I immediately braced myself. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't know if he was going to stop and let me go or if he was going to hurt me. Stop the car, I demanded, my voice trembling. Let me out right now. He glanced over at me again, but his expression hadn't changed. It was like he was enjoying my fear. We're almost there, he said, as if I should just trust him. That's when I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my phone and started tapping furiously. I knew I had to make a call, even if it was just to alert someone to what was happening. I dialed 911, trying to keep my hand steady as the car turned onto an even darker road. Before I could say anything to the dispatcher, the driver jerked the wheel, making the car swerve slightly. He looked at me then, finally meeting my eyes with a menacing glare. Hang up, he ordered. Now. I didn't even think. I hit the red button to end the call. My heart was thundering in my chest. I had no idea if I had just made things worse or saved myself. I took a deep breath and tried to gather myself. I needed to act quickly. Listen, I said, my voice much more firm now. I'm going to call the police. You can't do this. He didn't say anything for a moment, then nodded. It was almost like he had made up his mind about something. Finally, he slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. Get out, he said flatly. I didn't ask questions. I opened the door, ran out of the car, and didn't stop until I was far enough away that I could barely see the car's headlights in the distance. My legs felt like jelly, and I was breathing so fast I thought I might pass out. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. I don't know if I'd be here writing this. But I never took a rideshare again after that night, and I don't plan to anytime soon. It happened a few weeks ago, and I still can't stop thinking about it. It started off as an ordinary drive, just me on a quiet road, the kind that goes on forever with hardly any traffic. I'd been out for a few hours, taking the back roads through the countryside. My goal was just to clear my head, enjoy some solitude. The sun had started to set, casting everything in a dim golden light, and the road was empty. It was peaceful. But then I saw him. He was standing at the side of the road, waving his arms like he was trying to flag me down. At first, I thought it was a person in trouble. Maybe their car had broken down or they needed directions. I was alone, and it was the kind of road where help could be a long time coming, so I thought I'd stop and see if he was okay. It wasn't until I was closer that I started to get a bad feeling. There was something off about the way he was standing, how rigid he seemed, like he was almost too still for someone who was supposedly in need. I slowed the car, my instincts telling me to at least be cautious. As I got closer, the man didn't step forward, just stood there with his arms out, still waving, his face impossible to read. I could see his eyes now. Something about them, it wasn't panic or desperation, but more like calculation. The pit of my stomach tightened, but I told myself not to overthink it. I wasn't a kid anymore, and it was probably fine. I stopped a few feet from him, rolled down the window, and asked, "Hey, you need some help?" He didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, then back at me, and finally nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice a little rough. "I've been walking for miles. My truck broke down back there. I don't know what happened to it. Can you give me a lift to the gas station, just a few miles up the road?" Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. I could see that his clothes were dirty, but there wasn't any sign of a breakdown, no car nearby, no tools. Just this guy, standing on the side of the road, looking like he'd been out there for hours. I wanted to drive off, but I didn't want to seem rude. "Are you sure it's not far?" I asked, my eyes scanning the trees along the road behind him. "Yeah," he said quickly, shaking his head. "It's just up there. It's not far, I swear." I hesitated for a second longer, and that's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. From behind the trees, figures started to emerge. At first, I thought maybe they were other travelers, but then I saw the way they moved, purposeful, deliberate. It wasn't the casual walk of someone on a hike. It was controlled. That's when everything hit me. A chill ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. These weren't just random people. I don't know how I knew, but I could tell. I quickly rolled the window up halfway, keeping my hand on the door handle, just in case. The first figure that came out was a man, tall and broad, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Behind him, two more people, a woman and another man. They all looked off. Their clothes were mismatched, like they had been wearing whatever they could find. They weren't acting normal either. Their eyes were fixed on me, and they were moving with intent. The man who'd been standing by the road had stopped waving and was just staring at me now, a strange half-smile forming on his lips. I could feel my heart racing as my mind went into overdrive, calculating escape routes. I glanced behind me, trying to figure out if I could make a fast getaway. The road stretched out for miles, and I had no idea what was out there. I tried to force myself to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. The man who'd been flagging me down took a step closer, his hand resting on the side of my car. "You know," he said, his tone changing, becoming smoother, more menacing, "we don't take kindly to people who don't help each other out around here." My throat tightened. I wasn't stupid. I knew I had to get out of there, fast. But just as I was about to shift into drive, the man placed his hand on my side mirror and leaned down. "It'd be better if you just got out of the car," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. No reason to make this hard. The others had closed the distance now. The woman was smiling, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The two men were standing off to the side, each of them looking ready to move at any moment. I froze, not knowing what to do, but my instincts kicked in. I slammed my foot on the gas, spinning the wheels on the gravel before I sped off, throwing up a cloud of dust in my rearview mirror. My heart was pounding in my chest as I looked back once, seeing them all standing there in the middle of the road, watching me drive away. It was only when I rounded a corner and they disappeared from view that I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands still gripping the steering wheel as if I were holding on to my life itself. I didn't see them again, but I kept checking my mirrors the entire way, convinced they were somehow following me. I made it to the next town and found a small diner to stop at, where I called the police and explained everything. I wasn't sure if they would take me seriously, but they said they'd look into it. They told me to be cautious, but the road was too quiet and remote for them to have much information. I don't know who they were, but I'm glad I drove away. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed. I haven't gone back on that road since, and I don't think I ever will. Something about those people, I just knew they weren't out there for a friendly chat. And I still wonder if I was the only one they'd ever tried it with. I take my dog, Riley, out for a walk every night after dinner. It's just a habit, something to help wind down the day. Riley's a big mutt, mostly lab with something else mixed in, and he's full of energy. The neighborhood's quiet in the evenings, and I like the peace of it. That night, the air was crisp, and the sidewalks were mostly empty. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the occasional hum of a passing car was the only sound besides Riley's paws on the pavement. We were about 20 minutes into the walk, just coming up on a small park a few blocks from my house, when I saw another dog walker heading toward us. He had a medium-sized dog, something fluffy and light-colored, and he waved as he got closer. I nodded back out of politeness. When we got within a few feet of each other, he stopped, pulling his dog to a halt. Riley, being friendly as always, wagged his tail and sniffed in their direction. "Nice dog," the guy said. His voice was cheerful, maybe too much so, but I figured he was just being friendly. "Thanks," I said, not wanting to linger. "What breed is he?" he asked. "Not sure," I replied. "Some kind of mix. Looks strong. Protective, huh?" I shrugged, giving a quick tug on Riley's leash to signal we should keep moving. "He's a good dog." The guy took a small step closer. "What's his name?" "Riley," I said, glancing around. The street was empty, and the park up ahead was dark except for the faint glow of a distant lamppost. "Riley," he repeated, smiling. "I like that. How old is he?" "5, I said, keeping my answer short. I didn't want to be rude, but something about the way he was standing, the way his dog seemed almost secondary to him, made me uneasy. "You live around here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah, nearby," I said, not offering more. He nodded, still smiling. "I walk my dog here every night." "Never seen you before." I didn't respond to that. Instead, I gave Riley's leash another gentle pull, turning slightly to indicate I was ready to keep moving. The man didn't take the hint. "You usually walk this late?" he asked, stepping to the side just enough to block my path. It wasn't overt, but it was clear he was trying to keep me there. "Sometimes," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "We should get going. Have a good night." He didn't move. Instead, he leaned down and gave Riley a quick pat on the head. Riley, usually cautious around strangers, tensed slightly, and his tail stopped wagging. That was the first real sign that something was off. "Where do you live?" the man asked, his voice still friendly but with an edge I couldn't place. "Not far," I said, stepping to the side to go around him. He shifted too, keeping himself between me and the path forward. "Got a family? Wife? Kids?" That did it. My stomach tightened, and I felt a bead of sweat form at the back of my neck despite the cool air. "Why do you need to know that?" I asked, my voice firm now. He laughed, a short, dry sound. "Just making conversation. People around here can be so unfriendly." I didn't reply. I tugged on Riley's leash and took a deliberate step forward. This time, the man didn't move out of the way. Instead, he planted his feet and tilted his head, like he was sizing me up. "You in a hurry?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly, less friendly now. "Yeah," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's late." His smile faded, and for a moment, he just stood there, watching me. Riley crawled softly, a low rumble I'd never heard from him before. "You know," the man said, almost casually, "it's not smart to walk alone at night. You never know who you might run into." My heart was pounding now, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Thanks for the advice," I said, stepping to the side again. This time, I moved quickly, pulling Riley with me and putting some distance between us. The man didn't follow at first, but I could feel his eyes on me as I walked away. I kept my pace steady, not wanting to seem panicked, but every instinct in me was screaming to run. When I glanced back over my shoulder, he was standing in the same spot, watching me. His dog was sitting calmly by his side, like none of this was out of the ordinary. I turned forward again and focused on getting to the park's exit. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The rhythm of the steps was unmistakable, faster now, closing the gap. Riley crawled again, louder this time, and I tightened my grip on his leash. "Hey," the man called out, his voice sharp now, no trace of the earlier friendliness. "I wasn't done talking to you." I ignored him and quickened my pace. The exit was just ahead, the glow of a streetlight marking the edge of the park. "Hey," he shouted again, closer now. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see him out of the corner of my eye. He was walking fast, his dog trailing behind him. His face was hard to read in the dim light, but his body language was tense, aggressive. When I reached the street, I broke into a jog. Riley matched my pace, his ears pinned back. I could hear the man behind me, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. I didn't stop until I reached a house with its porch light on. I turned into the driveway, hoping the sight of someone's home would make him back off. Riley barked sharply, and I spun around, ready to confront him if I had to. But he was gone. The sidewalk was empty, the park behind me silent except for the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I waited for a few minutes, my chest heaving, my eyes scanning every shadow. There was no sign of him. I took a deep breath, adjusted Riley's leash, and made my way home, sticking to the most well-lit streets I could find. I don't know what he wanted or why he was so insistent, but I've changed my walking routine since then. I never go out that late anymore, and I keep a flashlight and pepper spray with me at all times. Riley doesn't wag his tail at strangers like he used to, and I can't say I blame him. It started out as a regular trip, or so I thought. I had a work conference in a small city, and after looking through dozens of hotel options, I decided to rent an Airbnb for the weekend. I'd used the platform before, and everything always went smoothly. So, when I booked a place, I assumed I'd have a quiet, hassle-free stay. The listing was simple enough, just a cozy, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. The photos looked fine, and the reviews were decent, but nothing extraordinary. Still, the price was right, and it seemed like a comfortable place to crash after long days at the conference. I arrived late on a Thursday evening. The host, a man in his 40s named Andrew, was very polite when I arrived, which made sense since it's common for hosts to meet guests personally. He showed me around the apartment, gave me a quick rundown of the house rules, and explained how to use the keyless entry system. Everything seemed normal at first. He seemed friendly, almost overly accommodating. I brushed it off as just someone eager to make a good impression. He left shortly after the tour, saying if I needed anything, I could reach him through the Airbnb app or by phone. That was the last time I saw him that night. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it at the conference, only returning to the apartment in the evenings to relax and rest. But by the time Friday rolled around, things started to feel a little off. Around 11 a.m., I was sitting at the kitchen table, answering emails and sipping my coffee, when I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole, and to my surprise, it was Andrew. I opened the door, confused but polite. "Hey, Andrew, everything okay?" I asked. "Oh, yeah, everything's fine," he said with a smile. "I just realized I forgot to drop off an extra set of towels for you. I'm really sorry about that. I wasn't bothered by it at first." He seemed to be in a hurry, and I assumed it was just a small oversight. He quickly handed me the towels and apologized again. I thanked him, and he left. But later that afternoon, I noticed something strange. I had been working in the living room, and when I walked into the kitchen, I saw that the cabinets were slightly ajar. It was a small detail, but it made me uneasy. I was sure I'd closed them when I made lunch earlier, but I didn't think much of it. The real trouble started that evening. I had just come back from the conference, and I was planning to have a quiet night in. It was around 7 p.m. when there was another knock at the door. I opened it, and this time, Andrew was standing there, looking a little too casual. "Hey, sorry to bother you again," he said, not meeting my eyes. I was wondering if I could just quickly check the water heater. We've been having some issues with it lately, and I need to make sure everything's running smoothly. I felt a sudden wave of discomfort wash over me. It seemed like an odd request, especially for a problem that didn't affect my stay. "Is everything okay with it?" "I didn't notice anything wrong," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Andrew seemed a bit too insistent. "It'll only take a minute," he said, then added, just a quick check to be sure." I was uncomfortable, but I didn't want to cause any trouble. I figured maybe he was just trying to be responsible. So, reluctantly, I stepped aside to let him in. He wandered into the hallway, but I stood in the doorway of the living room, keeping a close eye on him. He spent a little too long by the water heater, more time than I thought was necessary. But he eventually finished and said everything was fine. He thanked me for my patience, then left without another word. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I locked all the doors and made sure the windows were secure. But still, I felt uneasy. I kept thinking about his odd behavior, how he seemed too eager, how he kept showing up unannounced for things that could have easily waited. Saturday passed uneventfully, but I made sure to keep the door locked and the blinds shut, just in case. I had a feeling Andrew wouldn't just leave me alone. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. Around 2 p.m. the next day, there was another knock. This time, I was already on edge. I checked the peephole before opening the door, and it was Andrew again. He had a smile on his face, but something about it looked forced. "Hey, I was just wondering if I could get in the backyard for a few minutes to check on the garden," he asked casually. "The plants have been needing some attention, and I'd like to make sure everything's good for the next guests." I frowned, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You can do that later, right?" "I'm really busy right now," I said, trying to keep my tone polite but firm. He hesitated for a moment, then took a step closer to the door. "It won't take long, I promise. I just need to check the garden." His tone shifted, becoming more insistent. The way he stood so close to the door made me feel trapped. I wasn't about to let him in, but something in his eyes made me question if I should have said anything at all. I stepped back and said, "Sorry, but I don't feel comfortable with that. I've already had you in here twice today." Andrew's smile faltered for just a second, and he stepped back, but he didn't leave immediately. He stood there for a few moments, watching me with a strange look in his eyes. "All right," he finally said, almost too calmly. "But you know, if you need anything, I'm just down the street." I shut the door before he could say anything else. By now, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't explain why, but my gut was telling me I needed to leave. That night, I contacted Airbnb customer service and told them everything that had been happening. They assured me they'd take care of it, but I wasn't sure what that meant. The next morning, I decided to check out early. I didn't want to be in that apartment anymore, not with the constant interruptions, the feeling of being watched, and Andrew's increasingly erratic behavior. I packed up my things, returned the keys, and left. I was already planning to book a hotel for the rest of my trip. But before I left the neighborhood, I took one last look at the apartment from my car. And that's when I saw Andrew, standing in the window of the living room, watching me leave. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. But I do know that I'll never trust a stranger showing up uninvited again. And I certainly won't forget the unsettling feeling of having someone watch me like that, without reason or explanation. The car sputtered twice before dying completely. I was at the corner of 4th and Main, one of the busiest intersections in town, with traffic piling up around me. Drivers honked, and a few rolled down their windows to yell as they passed. I waved apologetically, my face burning with embarrassment. My car, a 15-year-old sedan I'd been meaning to replace, had been acting up for weeks. Now it had finally given up. I grabbed my phone and called my roadside assistance service. The operator told me it would be at least 45 minutes before a tow truck could get to me. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't surprising either. "Stay in your car with the doors locked," the operator advised before hanging up. "If anyone offers to help, let them know a tow is on the way." I nodded to myself, even though she couldn't see me. I locked the doors and settled into my seat, trying to look as unapproachable as possible. People kept honking as they passed, but no one stopped. That was fine by me. I didn't want anyone stopping. I just wanted the tow truck to hurry up and rescue me. About 10 minutes in, I saw a man approaching. He came from the sidewalk, weaving between the stopped cars to get to mine. He looked to be in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing jeans and a faded jacket. His hair was a little messy, and he had a kind of scruffy beard. I stiffened as he got closer, but I didn't roll down the window. He knocked on the driver's side door, then gestured for me to lower the window. I cracked it just enough to speak. Hi. I'm fine, thanks. I've got a tow truck on the way. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Oh, that's good. I just saw you sitting here and thought you might need some help. You know, these old cars can be tricky. I forced a polite smile. Thanks, but I'm all set. He didn't leave. Instead, he leaned closer, resting his hands on the roof of my car. What happened? Engine just cut out? Something like that, I said quickly. You know, he said, ignoring my obvious discomfort, I've worked on a lot of cars. I could take a look for you. Save you the trouble of waiting. I shook my head. Really, it's fine. The tow truck's already on its way. He didn't move. You sure? It might just be something simple. I could have you back on the road in no time. I'm sure, I said, my voice firmer this time. His smile faltered. For a moment, he just stood there, looking at me through the glass. Then he nodded, but instead of walking away, he circled around to the passenger side. I locked the passenger door before he could try it, and he stopped short, staring at the lock like he hadn't expected that. What's your name? He asked suddenly, looking at me again. The question caught me off guard. Ah, why? Just making conversation, he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. You seem nervous. Didn't mean to scare you. I didn't answer. I just stared straight ahead, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. You from around here? He asked, undeterred. My stomach tightened. Why would he need to know that? Look, I appreciate the offer, but I really need you to go, I said firmly. He tilted his head, his smile returning, but now it looked wrong, too wide, too forced. Just trying to be friendly. No need to get all upset. My heart was pounding. I glanced at my phone, which was sitting on the passenger seat. I considered calling the police, but he hadn't done anything illegal, at least not yet. How long did they say the tow truck would be? He asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. I didn't answer. Bet it's lonely sitting here all by yourself, he continued. Not the safest place to break down, you know. That did it. I picked up my phone and dialed 911. He saw what I was doing and his expression changed. The fake smile disappeared, replaced by something darker. He took a step back, raising his hands like he was trying to show he meant no harm. Hey, no need for that, he said, his voice hard now. I was just trying to help. I didn't respond. The dispatcher answered, and I quickly explained the situation, keeping my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. As I spoke, the man backed away. He glanced around, then turned and walked off, disappearing into the crowd of cars and pedestrians. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher until the tow truck arrived. The driver was friendly and professional, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease as we loaded up my car and drove to the nearest repair shop. Even now, I can't stop thinking about that man. He wasn't just some good Samaritan trying to help, he wanted something. I don't know what, and I don't want to know. But I'll never forget the way he looked at me through the glass, like he was sizing me up. Like he was deciding whether I'd be worth the effort. It was one of those quiet nights where the world feels a little too still. I had just gotten home from work, and my dog, Max, was practically bouncing off the walls, ready for his evening walk. I didn't mind, it was peaceful outside, and honestly, I looked forward to the fresh air after a long day. I put on my jacket, clipped Max's leash to his collar, and we set off down the street. I live in a pretty quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and there's hardly ever any real danger. It's the sort of place where you can take a late-night walk without worrying about much. I'd done it 100 times before, just me and Max, circling the block. The lights in the houses were mostly off, the streetlights casting long shadows along the sidewalk. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and Max's excited panting beside me. But tonight, something felt a little different. We had just passed the end of the block when I first noticed him. A man walking a few paces behind me. I hadn't heard him approach, but when I turned my head, I saw him. He wasn't walking aggressively or in any particular hurry. In fact, he seemed to be just walking at a normal pace, but his movements were too deliberate. As if he was making sure to keep just far enough behind that I wouldn't feel directly threatened. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a public street, after all. It was normal to pass someone on a walk, and maybe he just happened to be out for a stroll too. I continued walking, trying not to pay attention to the nagging feeling at the back of my mind. Max tugged on his leash, sniffing at the bushes along the sidewalk, and I focused on him, trying to keep my thoughts from spiraling. But after a few more steps, I glanced over my shoulder again. The man hadn't changed his position. He was still behind me, but now he was just far enough that I couldn't see his face clearly, only the outline of his body under the dim streetlights. He wasn't speeding up or slowing down. It was almost as if he was just keeping his distance. I started to feel uneasy. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just another late-night walker, like me. But the longer I walked, the more I noticed him. Every time I looked back, he was there, always keeping the same distance between us. It was like he was pacing me, moving at the exact same speed, staying just out of sight whenever I tried to glance over my shoulder. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to shake it off. It was probably nothing, right? People walked at night all the time. But why hadn't he passed me? If he had been out for a walk like I was, wouldn't he have walked faster or overtaken me by now? I quickened my pace, hoping that he would either pass me or stop following me. But as soon as I did, he did the same. His pace matched mine, keeping that same careful distance. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. This didn't feel like a random person out for a walk anymore. It felt like he was intentionally staying behind me. Max seemed to sense my change in mood. He started to pull harder on his leash, looking back nervously at the man behind us. That only made me more anxious. I kept walking, trying to calm Max down, but now every step felt heavier, like the air around me was thickening with unease. I reached the corner of the block and decided to turn. I figured that maybe he was just walking in a circle, like I often did. But when I turned, he turned too. It wasn't a coincidence. He had stayed directly behind me and now, without breaking stride, followed my change of direction. It was like he was making sure we stayed on the same path. At that point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to make sure I wasn't imagining things. I stopped walking abruptly, pretending to adjust Max's leash, trying to force a look back without being too obvious. Sure enough, the man had stopped too. He was still standing at the same spot, just far enough away that I couldn't get a good look at his face, but he was watching me. He hadn't been walking toward a destination. He had been following me. He was watching me. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. What was I supposed to do? Should I confront him? Or should I keep walking and hope he would leave me alone? But I didn't want to take any chances. I decided to do the one thing I had avoided doing, cut through the park behind my block. It was a shortcut, and it would take me away from the street and out of sight. I turned sharply, heading for the park entrance, and I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, quickening just a little, matching my speed. My heart skipped a beat. It was like he was reacting to my decision to change direction. I didn't look back this time. I just kept walking, my legs moving faster, feeling a sense of panic rising in my chest. Max was now pulling on the leash harder than ever, his ears back, his body tense. I reached the park and didn't look back again. Instead, I focused on the path ahead, the familiar trees lining the edges of the walkway. There were fewer lights here, but it was a more direct route home. But as I entered the park, I heard something that made my blood run cold, footsteps behind me. Faster now. Not just matching my pace, but speeding up. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. I didn't dare look back, but I knew he was there. I could hear him closing the distance, the sound of his footfalls getting louder. I couldn't risk it. I could feel the fear creeping up on me, tightening in my chest. I broke into a run. Max, who had been picking up on my panic, barked loudly and ran with me, his paws pounding on the pavement. My heart raced as I sprinted through the park, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I could only hear him now, his footsteps too close, the sound of them matching mine in a disturbing rhythm. It was as though he had anticipated my every move. I was almost to the other side of the park when I heard the unmistakable sound of him speeding up even more. Just as I neared the exit, I glanced over my shoulder. The man was right there, only a few feet behind me. I didn't think, I just pushed myself harder, desperate to get out of the park and back onto the main road. Finally, I saw the familiar glow of streetlights ahead, and I bolted for them, my legs burning, Max barking wildly beside me. I didn't look back once I hit the street. I just kept running, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me with every step. When I finally reached the safety of my front door, I stopped, panting, trying to gather myself. I looked back toward the park. There was no sign of him anymore, but I couldn't shake the feeling. He had been there, watching me, following me in the shadows. And even though I didn't see him again that night, the unease lingered. It stayed with me, a reminder of how quickly things can turn when something doesn't feel right. I don't walk late at night anymore. Not after that. I was walking home from my friend's house late in the evening. It wasn't dark yet, but the sun was low, and I knew I needed to get back before it got too late. I usually take the main roads, but that day, I decided to cut through the alley behind the hardware store. It saved about 10 minutes, and I'd walked through there plenty of times before without any problems. The alley wasn't long. You could see straight through to the other side where it opened back onto the street. There were a few dumpsters and some old wooden pallets leaning against the walls, but it was mostly empty. I didn't feel nervous at first. I was just focused on getting home. I was about halfway down when I heard footsteps behind me. They were close enough that I knew they weren't just someone passing through. I glanced back and saw two men walking toward me. They weren't running, but their pace was quick, like they were trying to catch up. One of them was wearing a dirty gray hoodie, and the other had on a leather jacket that looked way too heavy for the weather. They didn't look like anyone I'd seen around before. "Hey, wait up," the guy in the hoodie called out. I stopped but kept a little distance between us. I thought maybe they were going to ask for directions or something. When they got closer, the guy in the hoodie smiled, but it didn't feel friendly. "Don't you remember us?" he said. "We've met before." I shook my head. I don't think so. Sure we have, the guy in the leather jacket said. His voice was rough, like he'd been smoking a lot. You were with your dad at that car shop last month, right? You had the blue jacket on. I hadn't been to any car shop recently, and I didn't even own a blue jacket. I told them they must have me confused with someone else, but they didn't back off. Nah, it was definitely you, the guy in the hoodie insisted. He stepped closer, cutting off the path ahead of me. You're just playing dumb. I started to feel uneasy. My heart was beating faster, but I tried to keep my voice steady. I don't know what you're talking about. I need to get home. The guy in the leather jacket moved behind me, blocking the way I'd come. I was stuck between them. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall like he had all the time in the world. You're not in a hurry, are you? He asked. We just want to talk. Yeah, just talk, the hoodie guy said. What's the rush? I didn't answer. I was too busy trying to figure out what to do. My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't want to pull it out and make it obvious I was calling for help. I felt trapped, and the alley suddenly seemed a lot longer than it had a minute ago. The guy in the hoodie stepped even closer, invading my space. You live around here, right? We've seen you before. You're always walking this way. That made my stomach drop. If they really had been watching me, I hadn't noticed. I told them again they had the wrong person, but my voice was shaking now. They knew I was scared. Relax, the leather jacket guy said. We're just being friendly. You don't have to act all stuck up. I took a step back, but it didn't help. The hoodie guy matched my movement, keeping the distance the same. His smile was gone now, replaced by something colder. You think you're too good to talk to us? He asked, his tone sharper. I tried to step around him, but he moved to block me again. The leather jacket guy pushed off the wall and started closing the gap behind me. I was running out of space, and they both knew it. Let me go, I said, trying to sound firm, but my voice cracked. Go where? The hoodie guy said, almost laughing. We're not done yet. My hand was in my pocket now, gripping my phone, but I was too scared to pull it out. I felt like if I made one wrong move, things would get worse. Someone's going to come through here, I said, hoping to bluff them. This is a busy street. No one's coming, the leather jacket guy said. Why do you think we picked this spot? That's when I panicked. I bolted to the side, aiming for the small gap between the hoodie guy and the wall. He grabbed for me, but I twisted away and ran as fast as I could. I didn't look back, but I could hear them shouting and their footsteps pounding behind me. The other end of the alley felt like it was miles away. My chest was burning, and my legs felt like they might give out, but I didn't stop. I burst out onto the street, nearly colliding with a man walking his dog. I shouted for help, barely able to get the words out. The two guys stopped at the edge of the alley. They didn't come any further, probably because the street was busy enough that people would notice. They just stood there, staring at me, before turning and walking back the way they'd come. The man with the dog called the police for me. I was shaking so much I could barely explain what had happened. When the officers arrived, they took my statement and walked me home, but they didn't find the two men. They told me to avoid the alley from now on and to call them if I saw anything suspicious. I haven't taken that shortcut since. I don't think I ever will again. Even now, every time I see someone walking toward me, I feel a spike of fear, wondering if it's them. Wondering if they'll remember me. I'll never forget that day. It started out like any other, but it ended up being one of the most unsettling experiences I've ever had. I was on my way to a friend's house, just driving down the main road, when I noticed my car pulling to the side a bit. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe just the road being a little uneven, but then I heard a soft thumping sound. I looked at my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it. My tire was going flat. I didn't panic immediately, but I knew I couldn't just keep driving on it. I started looking for a place to stop, and just a few blocks away, I saw a mechanic shop. It looked like the kind of place that would still be open at that hour, and I figured it would be better to get the tire fixed now than to wait and risk making things worse. So I pulled into the lot, parked, and got out of the car, hoping someone could help me. A guy came out of the garage almost immediately. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a grease-stained shirt and a cap. He didn't look like the most friendly person, but I wasn't too concerned. I just needed my tire fixed. Flat tire, huh, he said, walking up to me with his hands in his pockets. His voice was low, but he didn't sound annoyed or anything. Yeah, I said, I was hoping you could fix it for me. I'm on my way to a friend's house, so I'm kind of in a hurry. He nodded slowly, like he was thinking about something. I can help you, sure. But I'll need to take a look at the whole car. It'll be easier to fix it if I can check everything first. I wasn't sure why he needed to check the whole car when all I needed was a tire change, but it didn't seem like a huge deal. I didn't want to seem difficult. Okay, I said, as long as it doesn't take too long. He didn't respond right away. He just walked around the car, inspecting it as if he was looking for something else. I stood there for a moment, feeling a little uncomfortable but trying to brush it off. I watched him move around my car, but something about the way he kept looking at me made me uneasy. He finally came back around to me, rubbing his chin. You know, this tire looks like it's been like this for a while, he said. It's probably a good idea to check the rest of the car. Let me take a look at the undercarriage too, just in case. It might save you from more issues down the line. I didn't want to argue. I wasn't really car savvy, and I didn't want to risk something else going wrong. Okay, sure, I said, but I really can't be here too long. Can we just focus on the tire? He smiled at me then, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something off about it. Don't worry, he said, I'll take care of it. Just hand me your keys. I'll take it inside, and I'll get it fixed up. Something about that didn't sit right with me. My keys were in my hand, and I froze for a moment, wondering if I should just leave and find another place. But then I remembered that I was in a bad spot. I didn't know where else to go at this point, and it was late. I handed him the keys, trying to shake the uneasy feeling from my chest. He took them, but instead of turning to go inside like I expected, he just stood there for a moment, staring at the keys in his hand. You know, he said, I'm going to need a bit of extra time to really make sure everything's in good condition. We get a lot of cars in here with hidden problems, and I wouldn't want you to get stuck somewhere else with more issues. His tone was casual, but the words didn't feel right. I could feel my heart start to race. Extra time? I asked, my voice a little shaky now. I just need the tire fixed. I don't think there's anything else wrong. He smiled again, but this time it seemed forced. Trust me. It'll be quicker if I check everything now. I didn't know what to do. My gut was telling me something was wrong, but I didn't know how to back out without making a scene. I stood there, feeling like I was trapped between not wanting to cause trouble and the feeling that I needed to leave. I took a deep breath, trying to sound calm. I really just need the tire fixed, I said. I don't want you to do anything else right now. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, blocking my path slightly. I'm just trying to help you out, you know, he said, his voice softer now. But it's your choice. If you want to leave, that's fine. But I'm telling you, you're going to regret not letting me take a better look at the car. I could feel the tension in the air. The way he was standing in front of me, blocking my way, made it feel like he was trying to corner me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every instinct in me was screaming to leave, to get back in my car and just drive away. I took another step back, looking around the parking lot. There weren't many other cars, and it was getting dark. The place felt abandoned, and the idea of being alone with him there made me feel sick. I think I'll just take my keys back and go, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't need your help. But when I reached out for the keys, he didn't let go. He held them tighter, his hand lingering on them like he wasn't going to let me take them back. I'm not done with your car yet, he said, his voice a little more insistent now. I really need to check it out. You're not going anywhere until I finish. I don't know why, but something in me snapped at that moment. I felt a surge of panic and anger. Without thinking, I yanked the keys out of his hand, and for a split second, I thought he was going to try to grab me or stop me, but instead, he just stood there, watching me. His eyes were cold now, like he didn't care what I did. He was just waiting for me to leave. I didn't wait another second. I rushed to my car, jumped in, and locked the door behind me. I drove out of the lot as fast as I could, not looking back. When I got home, I didn't know whether to be relieved or horrified by what had happened. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been trying to trap me somehow, to keep me there longer than I was comfortable with. I'll never know what he really had planned, but I can't forget the way he wouldn't let go of my keys, the way he tried to block me from leaving. I never went back to that shop. I don't even know if that guy was really a mechanic. I still get nervous whenever I have to stop for car trouble, always wondering if I'll end up in the same situation again. The store was busier than I expected for a weekday. I'd gone in just to grab a few shirts and maybe a new pair of jeans, nothing special, but the racks were packed with people flipping through hangers like it was a holiday sale. The fluorescent lights overhead were bright, the kind that made everything look a little washed out, and the music playing from the speakers was just loud enough to be distracting. I found a couple of shirts and a pair of jeans that seemed like they'd fit, so I headed to the dressing rooms at the back of the store. The attendant, a girl who couldn't have been much older than 19, looked bored out of her mind. She was leaning against the counter, scrolling on her phone, and barely glanced at me as I walked up. 3 items, I said, holding them up. She nodded, handed me a plastic number with 3 printed on it, and waved me toward the rooms without saying a word. The dressing rooms were empty, which I liked. There were 6 stalls, 3 on each side of a narrow hallway, with full-length mirrors at the end. I chose the first stall on the left, turned the lock, and hung my clothes on the hook inside. The room was small, just big enough for the bench, a mirror, and a little space to turn around. The walls didn't go all the way to the floor, and I could hear faint footsteps from the sales floor outside. I tried on the first shirt. It was a little snug in the shoulders, but it looked decent. I was checking myself out in the mirror when I thought I heard something like a faint shuffle, almost like someone brushing against the door. I paused and listened. Nothing. I chalked it up to my imagination and kept going. The second shirt was better, and the jeans fit perfectly. I decided to buy all 3 items and started getting dressed again. That's when I noticed something strange. The lock. It wouldn't turn. I jiggled it a little, thinking maybe it was stuck, but it didn't budge. I twisted harder, using both hands, but it was like it was jammed in place. "Hey," I called out, hoping the attendant would hear me. The lock stuck. No response. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. I crouched down to peek under the door, expecting to see the girl's legs or someone else walking by, but the hallway was empty. Okay, I thought. No big deal. Locks get stuck sometimes. I pulled out my phone and was about to call the store's front desk when the overhead lights flickered. Then they went out completely. I froze. The room was pitch black. I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. "Hello?" I shouted, louder now, panic creeping into my voice. The store's music had stopped too. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear if anyone was out there, but it was dead silent. I banged on the door. "Hey! I'm stuck in here." No answer. My heart was racing. I banged harder, shouting as loud as I could, but the door didn't budge, and no one came. I don't know how long I stood there, pounding on the door and yelling. It felt like forever. My throat was raw, and my fists were sore from hitting the wood. I tried the lock again, twisting it with everything I had, but it didn't move. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming down the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, desperate. "I'm in here." The door stuck. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. Relief flooded through me. "Thank God," I said. "Can you help me get out?" There was no response. "Hello?" I repeated, my voice trembling. Still nothing. I crouched down again, peering under the door, but whoever was out there wasn't standing close enough for me to see their feet. A cold, creeping fear settled in my chest. "This isn't funny," I said, my voice shaking. "If you're messing with me, just stop." The footsteps started again, but this time they were moving away. "Wait!" I shouted. "Don't go!" But they didn't stop. They faded down the hall until I couldn't hear them anymore. I was shaking now, barely able to keep my grip on my phone. I tried dialing the store's number, but there was no signal. That didn't make any sense. I had full bars when I walked in. I tried again. Nothing. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, trying to figure out what to do. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe the attendant had gone on break and didn't realize I was in here. Maybe there was a power outage and the staff was trying to fix it. But none of that explained the footsteps. Then I heard it. A faint scratching sound. It was coming from the wall behind me. I spun around, pressing my back against the door, and stared into the darkness. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like nails scraping against wood. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The scratching stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. The silence was deafening. Then, without warning, the lights flickered back on. I blinked, disoriented by the sudden brightness. The room looked the same as before, small, cramped, and empty. But something felt different. I turned to the door and tried the lock again. This time, it turned easily. The door swung open, and I stumbled into the hallway, expecting to see the attendant or someone from the store. The hallway was empty. The counter where the attendant had been was abandoned, and the rest of the dressing rooms were open and unoccupied. I hurried back to the sales floor, my heart pounding. The store was as busy as it had been when I arrived, people browsing racks and chatting like nothing had happened. I went straight to the front desk and told the cashier what had happened. She frowned and called the dressing room attendant over. The girl looked confused. "I didn't see anyone go in there," she said. "I thought all the rooms were empty." I insisted I'd been in there, that I'd gotten stuck and heard someone outside the door. She shook her head. "I don't know what to tell you. I was at the counter the whole time, and no one came back there. I left without buying anything. I couldn't get out of that store fast enough. I don't know what happened in that dressing room, and honestly, I don't want to know. I just know I'm never going back to that store again." I never thought much about picking up hitchhikers, but it was late, and the rain had started coming down hard. I was driving back from a business trip, and I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The roads were quiet, and I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me because of the rain. Then, on the side of the road, I saw him just standing there, drenched, thumb out, staring into the headlights. I debated for a second. Normally, I wouldn't stop, but something made me pull over. Maybe it was the way he looked. He seemed harmless, just a guy in his mid-30s, with a rain-soaked jacket and a tired face. I rolled down the window a bit. "You need a ride?" I asked. He nodded quickly, stepping toward the car. "Yeah, please. I've been waiting for a while." I unlocked the door, and he slid in. He thanked me as he shut the door, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Just past Clearwater," he said, looking out the window. "I'll get off soon. Just need to get out of the rain." "Clearwater?" "That's a couple hours away," I said, but I didn't mind. It was getting late, and I'd rather have some company on the road than not. We were the only two cars on the highway, and the rain wasn't showing any sign of stopping. "Yeah," he said, looking back at me. "I've got a friend out there. He's expecting me." His voice was calm, maybe a bit too calm for someone who had just been standing out in the pouring rain for who knows how long. I nodded and kept driving. For the next 20 minutes, there was silence between us. It wasn't uncomfortable, but there was something strange about him. He didn't seem to mind the quiet, and every so often, I'd catch him looking at me, like he was studying me. "You from around here?" he asked after a while. "No, just passing through," I replied. "Work trip?" He nodded slowly, his eyes drifting back to the window. "Yeah, me too. Just passing through. Gotta get somewhere important." I didn't know why, but something about that made me uneasy. It was like the way he said it, like he was hiding something. I kept my focus on the road, trying not to let my mind wander. After about another 10 minutes, I heard him shift in his seat. I glanced over and saw him looking at me, but his expression was different now. Harder. It wasn't that friendly face anymore. His eyes were cold. "You know," he said, his voice low, "you didn't really have to stop, you know. You didn't have to pick me up." I felt a little chill run down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. "You looked like you needed help," I said, glancing at him for a second before focusing back on the road. "I don't need anyone's help," he said, and now there was a sharpness to his voice. It wasn't the same person who had gotten into the car a while ago. "I just needed a ride, and now I'm stuck with you." I didn't know what to say. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe he was just a little too tired or maybe he'd had a rough day. "It's all right," I said, trying to lighten the mood. just trying to be friendly. He didn't respond. The air in the car had shifted. It wasn't the rain anymore, but something about the way he was sitting in his seat, his eyes locked on me, made the car feel smaller. He was still staring at me, unblinking. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "You should probably get out when we hit the next exit," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't move. Didn't say a word for a long time. I glanced at him, just as the headlights cut through the rain. "Hey," I said. Before I could finish, he suddenly reached forward, grabbing the door handle like he was about to throw it open. I swerved to the side, almost hitting the guardrail. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to regain control of the car. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice shaking now. He let go of the handle, but he was still staring at me, his face twisted into something I couldn't quite read. "You think I'm just gonna let you tell me what to do? You think I'm just gonna get out when you say so?" The rain was pounding harder now, and the headlights barely cut through it. I tried to focus on the road, my hands slipping on the wheel. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I said, my voice shaky. "You're not as nice as you think," he muttered. "You pick me up, so you deal with me now." I was starting to panic, but I tried not to show it. I didn't want to make him angrier. "I'll pull over at the next exit," I said. "You can get out there." He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in his seat and chuckled. It wasn't a laugh, it was a low, eerie sound, like he was mocking me. "You think I'm gonna get out? After all this?" I looked at him again, this time fully aware of the danger. He wasn't planning on leaving. I knew it then, but I wasn't sure what to do. "You need to get out," I said again, my voice firm, but my heart was racing. But now he just grinned. It was a slow, deliberate smile, and something in it made me want to vomit. "You don't get it, do you?" "I'm not getting out," he said. I was trembling now, but I wasn't about to let him have control. I quickly reached for my phone, planning to call for help, but before I could do anything, he reached across the seat and grabbed my wrist. His fingers were like iron, digging into my skin. "You can't just call someone," he hissed. I yanked my wrist away, my mind racing. I had to think fast. I couldn't let him control this situation. I focused on the road, trying to remain calm, even though panic was rising inside me. I remembered the gun I kept in the glove box. I had never used it, but I had it there for situations like this. He must have seen the shift in my expression because he leaned forward, his face inches from mine. "You think that'll help?" he whispered, his breath hot and rank in my face. But before I could react, I saw the lights of another car in the distance. Relief flooded me, and for a split second, I thought I might get out of this alive. The car was close, and I steered toward it. My foot slammed on the gas, and I cut across 2 lanes to get behind the other vehicle. I looked in my rearview mirror and saw the hitchhiker still watching me, his eyes burning into the back of my skull. I wasn't safe yet, but I was getting closer. I couldn't go back to the road we'd been on, but I could keep driving. I had to keep driving, away from him, away from whatever the hell he had planned. When I finally found a gas station and stopped, I jumped out of the car, locked the doors, and ran inside. I didn't stop until I was inside, safe. The stranger never followed me inside, but I swear I saw him standing outside in the rain, watching me through the window.